Ok, ok. Bon, les amis. Les amis. L'heure est grave. Ok? L'heure est extrêmement grave. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, nous allons faire quelque chose dont je vous ai parlé maintenant depuis quelques temps. J'avais dit qu'à partir du moment où j'aurais terminé l'histoire de Hollow Knight, alors on allait regarder justement une vidéo qui traite du lore de Hollow Knight et qui parle un petit peu de tout ça. Et donc du coup, moi ça me tient particulièrement à cœur parce que j'avais vraiment envie de faire ça pour pouvoir comprendre un petit peu plus. Le lore de Hollow Knight est quand même extrêmement crypté et je trouve que simplement en jouant, on a du mal quand même à comprendre vers quoi on va, etc. Et j'ai vu qu'il y avait des questions vis-à-vis de est-ce qu'il y a du spoil, etc. Globalement, la vidéo s'appelle l'histoire quasiment complète de Hollow Knight. Donc oui, même moi qui ai fait 25 heures de jeu, je vais me faire spoil sur plein de choses, je pense, c'est sûr et certain. Donc si vous n'avez pas envie d'être spoil / backseat, je peux complètement le comprendre. Le but c'est de réacter à cette vidéo, c'est une vidéo qui dure 1h17. Probablement aussi que la rediff de ça ira sur YouTube, d'ailleurs ça me fait penser que du coup je vais enlever ma piste. Je vais enlever ma piste en mode musique. Je vais mettre... ça va aller dans par défaut, je pense. Ce sera très simple. Et du coup, si je fais ça... Non, je sais pas. Attends. Voilà, très bien. Très bien. Attends, j'ai pas mon café. Tranquille. Donc, on va réacter à ça. Merci aussi, bien évidemment, pour toutes les personnes qui étaient présentes vis-à-vis de Trackmania. On a découvert pas mal de maps aujourd'hui. Encore une fois aussi, hein, toutes ces découvertes de cartes et tout vont sur YouTube. Si jamais vous en avez raté certaines, n'hésitez pas, ce sera l'important. Il y a tout ça qui sortira sur YouTube bientôt. Mais voilà, je vous avais dit qu'aux alentours de 15h, c'est ce qu'on allait faire. Il est 14h56. Donc, c'est une vidéo que beaucoup de gens m'ont conseillé de regarder pour comprendre un petit peu le lore de Hollow Knight. Aussi... indication supplémentaire, c'est une vidéo en anglais mais qui est totalement sous-titrée en français, donc c'est comme si on allait regarder une série en VO stuffreux. Pour être tout à fait honnête, je vais pas faire de traduction, hein, c'est vraiment pas le but, mais vous en tant que spectateur, si jamais vous avez des questions sur n'importe quel sujet, quel que soit le cas, faut pas du tout hésiter à poser des questions, à faire des remarques, des suggestions et tout. Le but c'est de réacter un peu ensemble à toute cette vidéo et à tout ce qui va se passer. J'avoue que j'ai vraiment hâte parce que autant il y a des lores de jeux vidéo que je comprends mais que je comprends pas à 100%, mais en tout cas que je comprends en grande majorité, autant le lore de Hollow Knight, j'ai vraiment fini le jeu en mode bon, bah j'ai évolué dans un monde, j'ai tué des monstres et des boss, mais voilà quoi, hein, on a rien compris quoi, super. Donc voilà. Je sais pas si selon vous merde. Le titre du live est assez explicite ou quoi. Mais on va voir. Mozart fait vraiment des vidéos quali, hâte de devoir react. Bah écoutez, on va partir là-dessus. Bam, nous avons la vidéo en plein écran. On est prêt? Vous êtes prêts? Moi j'ai même un petit taboulé avec moi. Histoire de finalement de me nourrir en simplicité pendant qu'on regarde un petit peu ça, hein. Vraiment très simple, j'aime beaucoup. T'as pas tweet? J'ai pas tweet, mais après je peux le mettre. Attends, parce que par contre ce qui est chiant c'est que le titre ici est traduit. Moi je veux pas qu'il soit traduit du coup le titre là. Bon attends, on va faire ça. Et ce qu'on va faire c'est que Poupzo, justement, tu m'avais envoyé un message. Et donc, je vais mettre, pour tous ceux qui ont suivi mon let's play Hollow Knight et qui souhaitent en savoir plus, 2 points. Hop. Hop là. Je fais un petit tweet, en effet. Il y a peut-être des gens, justement, qui n'étaient pas sur le live avant parce qu'ils s'en foutaient de la partie Trackmania et qui sont pas forcément au courant de ça et tout. Donc voilà. Et tu sais quoi, je vais même mettre une petite image de Hollow Knight. Comme ça au moins, ça pourra potentiellement attirer l'œil. Tac, tac, tac. Tweeté. Très bien. Une chose automatiquement les titres, ça me donne envie de péter un gigaplomb. Bah, en fait, moi, ça dépend. Mais j'ai l'impression que c'est parce que j'ai accédé à la vidéo d'une certaine manière. Tu vois, je sais pas pourquoi, mais voilà. Oh, Pinou, let's go. Je vais vite me chercher à manger, je me pose. Est-ce que je fais encore les Cup of the Day? Non, pas vraiment. Parce qu'en fait, je live pas à 19h, moi. Je live pas à 19h, donc du coup, bah, je fais pas de Cup of the Day, quoi. Parce que le truc, c'est que quand je live à partir de 11h, pour être présent à 19h, pour en plus de ça se faire une Cup of the Day de 19h à 20h, c'est un peu costaud, quoi. C'est un peu costaud. Ok, on est parti. Let's go. Mossback que je connais pas du tout. Donc ouais, un warning, voilà, cette vidéo contient des spoilers sur Hollow Knight. Souvenez-vous avant d'embarquer dans cette aventure ou pas, je m'en fous, je suis juste un texte sur un écran.
If you were to ask me, what is your favorite video game ever made? I would have to say Cory in the House for the Nintendo DS.
Moi je dirais
Hollow Knight
Adibou.
would be a close second. Hollow Knight was released on February 24th, 2017.
Par Team Cherry. D'ailleurs, je ne sais pas, je ne sais pas ce que Team Cherry a fait d'autre comme jeu. Bon alors oui, hein, il va y avoir pas mal de de pause and play sur cette vidéo. Faut pas râler. Faut pas râler, c'est moi qui décide. Non mais Team Cherry Games, je sais pas s'ils ont fait autre chose que ça. Hein. Ah non, ils ont fait que Hollow Knight. Ah ouais, d'accord, ok. Ok. Et donc du coup, bah, y a Sixon qui sortira bientôt. Ah ouais, c'est hyper intéressant. Et un jeu Flash. Alors, basé sur les terres mythiques d'Adélaïde, au sud de l'Australie. Très bien.
Over the past 3 years, Hollow Knight has become an indie darling. The game has sold over 3.5 million copies. It was the opening game at ADG.
On va voir vis-à-vis du son aussi s'il y a des choses qui... Si c'est pas assez fort ou pas, mais tranquille.
T-shirts, nicotine patches, nuclear warheads, and even vinyl records for all you goddamn hipsters. Team Cherry had one goal when making
Et ouais, Sixsong bientôt, hein.
They wanted to create a world that allowed players to get completely lost in exploration.
C'est exactement ce qui m'est arrivé du coup. Donc ils ont réussi, hein. En réalité, ils ont réussi, hein. Ils voulaient créer un monde qui permettait aux joueurs de se perdre complètement en l'explorant. Totalement réussi, quoi. Absolument réussi.
We can see this desire in Hollow Knight's design. The levels in Hollow Knight are massive, with secrets and rewards hidden in every nook and cranny.
Ah, la ruche!
Powerful charms, special abilities, or the game's navigation system requires the player to work for their map, forcing them to make a stronger mental image of the world in their head. Christopher Larkin's score and Ari Gibson's artwork lend to this as well, creating an atmosphere that the player won't want to leave.
Ça c'est vrai aussi.
But there's one aspect of Hollow Knight that keeps people like me coming back. The world building.
Ok. La construction du monde. Ouais, bon après, l'environnement ou l'histoire quoi.
In 1994, it stood out for its amazing sense of immersion.
À savoir d'ailleurs que de mon côté, donc je sais que Hollow Knight est un Metroidvania, et de mon côté, je n'ai joué à aucun Metroid de ma vie. Je pense qu'il y en a eu plusieurs quand même. J'avoue que là, alors là, pareil, hein, partie lore que je ne connais strictement rien de la partie Metroid. Moi, je n'ai pas du tout été bercé par ça. Ah oui, d'accord. On a une espèce de fiche, de sorte de chronologie sur Wikipédia assez intéressante. Alors, je sais pas qui amène à quoi. Donc, c'est vrai qu'il y a le Metroid Prime 4 qui a été annoncé, je crois, au Summer Game Fest aussi. Donc, Metroidvania, c'est une contraction de Metroid et Castlevania déjà. Oui, en plus, oui, c'est vrai. C'est vrai. J'ai parlé que de Metroid, mais du coup, voilà. Mais en vrai, il n'y a que 5 Metroid 2D. Ok. Mais je n'en ai pas fait un seul de ma vie. Mais c'est vrai que, bah, en fait, je trouve que quand t'es pas baigné là-dedans, quand t'es jeune, et qu'ensuite tu joues que à des jeux qui sont plutôt actuels, bah, il n'y a rien qui t'amène à y revenir d'une certaine manière.
Now in 1994, I was busy not being alive, but I watched enough YouTube video essays to know that this game was a big deal. In case you didn't know, Super Metroid is basically the grand... Ah, j'avoue qu'il est pas de mon côté.
Ah mais il est branché en bas et tout. Après tu peux prendre n'importe quel classique câble.
Granddaddy of all Metroidvanias. That's why they're called Metroidvanias. Now in Super Metroid, there are moments that give the player a sense of depth. Basically the feeling that this world exists outside of Samus's interactions with it. In the room right before that diabetic crocodile thing, Samus can find the corpse of a random soldier. His inclusion here doesn't change the gameplay at all, but instead gives the player a sense of wonder about the world they are exploring.
Ouais.
Who was this guy? Why was he here in the first place? Did he like jazz? Now, finding dead bodies and other random garbage is pretty cool, right? Well, Hollow Knight basically does the same thing, about a dozen times. Through its world building, Hollow Knight turns Hallownest into a living kingdom. You can sense the ancient history of the land when you look at dilapidated structures or giant barred doors. Nothing feels like it was put into the game randomly. There's a reason.
C'est vrai, c'est vrai, c'est vrai. Hein.
Except those reasons aren't the easiest to uncover. Hollow Knight's narrative is buried under layers of NPC dialogue.
En fait, c'est vrai que quand t'es plongé dans l'environnement et juste en train de jouer et en train d'avancer, il y a toujours quelque chose qui va t'attirer l'œil, tu vas dire putain il pourrait y avoir un truc là ou il pourrait y avoir un truc là et tout, et au fil du temps bon ben il y a certains trucs où tu te rends compte qu'il y a rien quoi, donc tu te poses plus vraiment de questions, mais c'est vrai que c'est vraiment le feeling que ça donne.
Dialogue, item descriptions, lore tablets, and even additional content like the Quarrel comic and Fangamer's Wanderer's Journal. These past 3 years have seen an insane amount of research by the Hollow Knight community to make sense of Team Cherry's sprawling world. We've even made it to the point where people are looking at the in-game signs to try and decipher Hallownest's logographic language. In this video, I hope to give you a long and detailed look into the world of Hollow Knight, exploring Hallownest's history and uncertain future. When I'm not busy making surprisingly accurate Super Smash Bros. Roster speculation videos, or insightful podcasts about beloved subjects like the Donkey Kong Country television series, or whatever this was supposed to be, I'm usually making videos about Hollow Knight, and while I am a seasoned Hollow Knight lore expert, I cannot confirm that every musing or theory presented in this video is completely correct. I highly recommend checking out the lore section of the Hollow Knight wiki if you want a more neutral explanation of Hollow Knight's lore.
Et c'est vrai que ça c'est vraiment la partie ouf, et je sais pas trop comment vous positionnez par rapport à ça, mais c'est... Je pense à tous ces gens-là qui ont découvert Hollow Knight la première fois et qui du coup au fur et à mesure se sont réunis pour essayer d'aller bien plus loin que de simplement jouer au jeu, mais d'essayer de comprendre toutes les subtilités qu'il peut y avoir dans le jeu et tout, tu vois. Et j'avoue que moi je fais pas du tout partie de ces gens-là, je suis plus du style à passer sur mon jeu et jouer. Et ça me fait penser aussi à l'énorme enquête qu'il y avait eu sur le jeu Trial. Je sais plus, c'était pas Trial Evolution ou un truc comme ça, où il y avait eu l'énorme easter egg de fou, et du coup t'as des gens qui se plongent là-dedans en tant que détective, et c'est vrai que moi je vais pas trop là-dedans, tu vois. Ouais, vraiment, hein, c'est un truc de fou. Hein.
But if you're too lazy to read, then I suggest you sit back, order some Domino's pizza, or just grab a block of cheese from the fridge, and enjoy the mostly complete lore of Hollow Knight.
Oui, je pense par contre que quand tu joues avec d'autres personnes, enfin, ou quand tu connais d'autres personnes justement qui ont joué au jeu et que du coup t'en parles et que tu parles de certains trucs, peut-être que tu te poses plus de questions, du coup tu reviens sur le jeu, etc. Mais du coup, pareil, moi aussi ça me passionne, mais de là à ce que, en tant que joueur, au moment de jouer, je me mette dessus, bah du coup jamais, tu vois. Pour le coup jamais. C'est ça moi qui m'intrigue, c'est ces personnes-là qui se disent putain en fait j'ai envie d'en savoir plus quoi.
It's a simple fact of life that every human worships a god, be that technology, ideologies, or in rare cases, God. As it turns out, bugs in Hallownest pretty much operate in the same way. From the Mosskin born from the dream of a giant slug, to the emo kids of the ancient civilization who literally worship the darkness, there is no shortage of things to worship in the world of Hollow Knight. Our story begins with a creature very much worthy of worship. A creature born from the carcass of a worm. The carcass can still be found in the Kingdom's Edge, and it's our only good look at what worms actually looked like. At the time Hollow Knight occurs, it is suggested there are no worms left in the world. They were incredibly long creatures that featured little to no limbs. Another more mysterious property of worms was that they had some kind of prescience or foresight. Basically, they could see the future to some capacity. It isn't clear how effective this ability was. Considering how the entire race went extinct, this foresight ability must have been pretty shit. Getting back to this particular worm carcass, it is explained that this worm traveled across the distant mountains and wastelands beyond Hallownest. Once it arrived in Hallownest, the worm died.
Pour ta question, Kipso, quand tu parles de regarder le lore de Hollow Knight et que... Je suis en train de m'étouffer. Et que 80% des réponses te donnent cette vidéo. Bah tu regardes cette vidéo. Et le problème c'est que je n'allais pas regarder toutes les vidéos de lore de Hollow Knight pour savoir laquelle était la mieux à vous présenter en live. Je découvre comme vous. Donc du coup voilà.
Except not really. Inside the maw of the carcass sits a pale broken egg.
Ok, ouais, le fameux.
Which hatched a new form of worm, a being of meager shell. This form of the worm is usually referred to as the Pale King, and he's the character basically responsible for everything that happens in Hollow Knight.
En fait, le truc c'est que en tant que joueur, du coup, le Pale King, on le connaît, ok, c'est cool, mais en fait, on sait pas à quoi il sert, qu'est-ce qu'il fait, juste on sait pas quoi.
The Pale King is a higher being, a type of creature that exists above all others. His body was said to shine with a radiant visage that harmed those who looked upon him. The ultimate goal of the Pale King seemed to be in line with that of other worms. A line from the cryptic Mr. Mushroom reads, "Worms pull bugs into their thrall, till ages pass and kingdoms fall."
Merci Crazy Barge 85 pour les 5 mois, merci beaucoup.
In other words, it's just in their nature. Dogs wag their tails, cats bury their shit, and worms bring massive amounts of bugs into their service in order to form long-standing kingdoms and civilizations.
Je suis pas sûr que dans la vraie vie, les vers fassent ça. Honnêtement, je pense pas. Je pense pas. Monsieur Champignon. Merde avec Wingo! Je pense pas qu'ils disent ça non plus, Monsieur Champignon, ça m'étonnerait.
And here in a far corner of the world, the Pale King emerged from the corpse of his former self and began to build his eternal kingdom, Hallownest.
Ok, donc en fait, c'est...
There's this one slight problem. There's like people already living there. The area that would eventually become Hallownest was already filled with mantises.
Alors, moi je sais qu'il y a une zone que je n'ai pas découvert. Je sais qu'il y a une zone que je n'ai pas découvert. Et que forcément, quand t'as ce genre de map, du coup, je peux me faire spoil. Parce que du coup, Attends. Est-ce qu'il y a bel et bien une zone que je n'ai pas découvert? Parce que il me semble qu'il y avait tout le monde qui me disait à chaque fois qu'il y avait une zone que je n'avais pas découvert. Il y a... Ah, bah c'est... Tout ça, là. Tout ça, je pense. Glade of Hope et la partie d'en bas. Ça me dit rien dit comme ça, là. Ah, mais si, bah si, bien sûr, ok, je suis trop bête. Puisqu'il y a notre... Si, ok, donc ça c'est bon. Mais... Lake of Hoon, je l'ai fait. Bah du coup, j'arrive même pas à voir. Parce que The Hive, je l'ai fait. Kingdom's Edge, j'ai fait. Ta City of Tears, c'est... Elle est trop belle, cette map, par contre. Hein. Il parlait juste du palais. Bah je sais pas, même à la fin de ma dernière session, il y avait des gens justement qui me disaient ouais, t'avais toutes les zones mais pas toute la map complète. Ouais, ok. Ah, The Hive, je l'ai découvert. Hein.
Bees, moths, spiders.
Okay. Non mais dans ce cas, j'ai bel et bien toutes les zones. La map comme ça, elle est vraiment cool. Hein.
Already operating with their own cultures and societies, and each group had a different interaction with the Pale King. One of the more receptive groups to the arrival of the Pale King were the mushrooms of the fungal wastes.
Okay.
These creatures were able to communicate with one another through one shared mind.
Okay.
The mushrooms viewed this shared mind as a strength, and they were kind of smug dickheads about it. Ultimately, the mushrooms wearily accepted the Pale King's rule, viewing his foresight as a shield to the dangers of the future.
Okay.
Another group living in the fungal wastes is the Mantis tribe. The Mantises have a rich cultural history reaching back to long before the birth of Hallownest. The Mantises are a proud tribe, believing in the importance of proving one's physical strength. The mantises
Ça, on a vu.
are fiercely territorial, but will show respect to those who display great power.
Ça aussi, on a vu.
These Fight Club enthusiasts were led by 4 powerful mantis lords, who I guess just kind of sat around waiting for outsiders to challenge them. The mantis tribe had no interest in the Pale King's
Oui,
kingdom.
j'avoue qu'il a dit fort, mais du coup, là, on en a que 3, quoi. Rester assise à attendre que des étrangers les défient. Bah, nous, c'est ce qu'on a fait, du coup, hein, mais...
Waiting for outsiders
Just pretend there's another mantis here, thanks.
The mantis tribe had no interest in the Pale King's kingdom, but the 2 communities did come to a truce. In exchange for their independence from Hallownest, the
Ouais, je l'ai
mantis
vu à la
tribe
fin.
kept the beasts of Deep Nest from invading Hallownest.
Le
Not sure
fameux.
why they didn't just go out the other exits.
Alors, attends. Je regarde des petites choses. Moi, ça m'intrigue, hein. Moi, j'aime bien, ça m'intrigue, là, hein.
From Deep Nest, but whatever. I'm not an expert on border patrol. I don't work at ICE anymore. Let's move on to Deep Nest.
Deep Nest.
Now, many of the
La
different
meilleure
tribes of
zone.
Hallownest were kind enough to leave lore tablets behind, detailing pretty much everything we need to know about them.
Ok.
Unfortunately, the bugs of Deep Nest didn't do that. We know that the spiders of Deep Nest had a monarchy because why not? Those are always good, right? Also, within Deep Nest are a separate group of spiders that immigrated to
Pas sûr.
Deep Nest at some point in the past. This group
Ok.
was known as the Weavers, and they established their own culture and history within Deep Nest.
Ça, on a
They
vu.
used looms of silk to weave stories, spells, and shields.
Ok.
One thing we know for sure about Deep Nest is that they really didn't want anything to do with Hallownest. The struggles of Deep Nest-Hallownest relations would become painfully clear as time goes on,
Okay.
but for right now, it seems like the two remained fairly isolated from one another. Another section of pre-Hallownest includes Green Path.
Green
Now, as far as
Path.
we can tell, the mushroom
La vraie meilleure zone de Hollow Knight. C'est-à-dire que Deep Nest est la troll meilleure zone de Hollow Knight et Verchemin est la good meilleure zone de Hollow Knight.
mushrooms, mantises, and spiders of Deep Nest didn't worship any higher beings. There is this giant mushroom corpse in the
Ouais.
fungal core, but I don't think this is a higher being. I mean, who the hell would want to worship a fat-ass mushroom? Fat-ass slugs? Now that's dope. The land we know as Green Path was created by the higher being known as Un. Un used her great mind to dream the vegetation of Green Path.
Ouais,
into the once barren
pareil, on
caverns.
comprend pas, mais ça a
Un's
l'air important.
followers, the Mosskin, were also born out of Un's dream, making her their creator.
Ok.
Green Path at its height was actually much larger than we see in game. At one point, Green Path stretched into both modern-day Queen's Garden and possibly Fog Canyon. Green Path's citizens showed themselves to be a fairly developed society. They built a temple at the Lake of Un in order to worship her, and they even had their own line of defense, with Moss Knights showing proficiency in combat, using
Ouais.
nails and shells as weapons.
Ils étaient chiants eux
The
d'ailleurs.
law of Un continued to remain in effect even after the Pale King arrived, but it seems like they allowed the king to establish a road through their lands, leading travelers to the heart of Hallownest. Hence the name Green Path.
Ouais.
Yeah, Team Cherry really racked their brains when naming this area, didn't they? Next, we have the bees. And while there is no lore in
Ah, d'ailleurs, la ruche, moi je l'ai découvert. La ruche, je pense, je l'ai découvert vers une quinzaine d'heures de jeu, je pense, quelque chose comme ça. Une quinzaine d'heures. Ouais, je pense à peu près comme ça, ouais.
how these bees can turn into fucking drills, or how they can ignore all known laws of aviation, we do know how they reacted to the Pale King. These bugs decided to seal their hive off from the rest of the world,
Ouais,
with only patrol bees being able to enter and exit the hive.
ouais.
So yeah, the bees are pretty much pointless in this story. And finally we have the Moth Tribe. In-game, the only moth settlement is in the Resting Grounds, but the tribe might have also inhabited the Crystal Peak at one point. Now, as we all know, moths in real life are just complete assholes. As for the moths in Hollow Knight, well, it's a bit complicated. The moth race is described as being a rather pacifist group, with few
Ah,
ever choosing to take up a
Pour le coup,
weapon.
ouais, c'est parmi les
During
PNJ
the
qui nous ont un
Pale
petit
King's
peu le
reign,
plus
the moth
accompagnés
race
et aidés,
dealt
quoi.
amongst dreams and the dead, displaying the importance of remembering those who have passed, as
Okay.
well as learning how to shape dreams themselves. Similar to the Mothkin, the Moth Tribe was born from a higher being, known as the Radiance.
Ah!
The Radiance is described as being a light in which the moth
Mais Radiance, mais pareil, moi j'avoue que quand j'ai vu Radiance, j'étais en mode, mais cette entité ou ce personnage est complètement différent du reste du monde. Tu sais, je trouvais presque même que c'était un peu bizarre, quoi, que c'était un peu weird.
tribe basked. So she was basically a giant lamp to them, Another important aspect about the radiance is
Giant
it ties to
lamp.
dreams and a substance known as essence.
Ouais, ok.
Essence are the remains of wishes and dreams, and are represented in-game by these dream catcher particle effects.
Ouais, ouais.
Essence can take the form of whispering roots, as well as dream ghosts, both of which are memories taking root in the world. The Radiance appears to be a creature made of essence, but she isn't the only higher being to give off essence. Un has green particles, the Pale King has gray particles, and this sexy character named Grim gives off fiery red particles. However, the Radiance appears
Y a pas full gens qui m'avaient spam en mode est-ce qu'il a fait Grim, est-ce qu'il a fait Grim, est-ce qu'il a fait Grim, parce que ça c'est un personnage par exemple que je n'ai, je crois, jamais croisé, ou en tout cas ça me dit rien. Hein. Ouais, ouais. Donc lui je pense que Grim du coup je ne l'ai pas fait, je sais pas trop où est-ce qu'il traîne, ça a l'air d'être, tu sais il y a l'espèce de tour de l'amour là machin, je sais pas si c'est vers là-bas mais ça ressemble un peu quoi. C'est un DLC. Ouais, j'irai le chercher un de ces quatre. Bon, de toute façon, vous savez très bien que suite à cette vidéo, je reviendrai sur le jeu aussi. Il faut le trouver. Et c'est un DLC. Ok, très bien.
to be the main god when it comes to dreams, even if other gods also dabble in the dream realm. Getting back to the Moth tribe,
Ouais.
it is their interaction with the Pale King that we need to discuss.
Ok.
Basically, the Moths turned their backs on the Radiance completely, in order to worship the new light that had appeared. The Pale King's
Ok,
light.
ok, ok, intéressant ça.
Moths are assholes in this game too. With her tribe forsaking her, the Radiance became a forgotten memory, a remnant of the past, and a thing that's definitely not going to come up again later in this video. And so the Pale King's new...
Non, mais je sais hein, que c'est directement intégré dans le jeu, etc. Mais il faut le trouver. C'est plutôt ça, hein, il faut le trouver. Mais l'histoire de DLC et tout, ça c'est pas du tout un problème. Et du coup, est-ce que là, il y a... Est-ce qu'à partir de ça, on peut voir Path of Pain ou pas du tout? Palace Grounds... Ouais, non, c'est vraiment un truc caché qui est en dehors de cette map là.
kingdom was established, Hallownest.
Ok.
But there is one aspect of Hallownest that we need to discuss. Unfortunately, to better understand this, we're going to have to read some poetry.
Ok.
In Wilds Beyond they speak your name with reverence and regret. For none could tame our savage souls, yet you the challenge met. Under Palest watch you taught, we changed. Base instincts were redeemed. A world you gave to bug and beast as they had never
Poetry.
dreamed. This is from a poem titled Elegy for Hallownest, written by Motomon the Teacher. The poem appears at the beginning of every playthrough, and hints at what the Pale King and his kingdom offered. Much of the land outside of Hallownest appears to be a wasteland, where
Ouais.
bugs survive off of instinct, without the burden of mind. Hallownest somehow taught these bugs and tamed their savagery. Basically, the Pale King changed the instincts of his subjects and granted them higher thought. To get a better picture of this, let's look
Destabot?
at two different characters, Boone and Tuck. These adorable panda bug things give us a clear display of Hallownest's effect. While both appear to be
Mais... Je les ai croisés eux?
the same species of bug, Boone is dumb as a sack of rocks, struggling to string together words, while Tuck speaks fairly clearly. The main difference between these two characters is that while Boone lives outside of Hallownest, Tuck lives beneath the city's capital. Basically, it appears
Sous la
as though
capitale.
Hallownest is a literal holy ground that raises the intelligence of those who dwell within. The Pale King established a path, starting from the kingdom's entrance in King's Pass, winding through Greenpath and the fungal wastes, and finally ending at the massive capital at Hallownest's heart.
Ouais.
We now know the capital city as the City of Tears, but that was likely not its original name.
Ok.
The rain that falls down onto the city from the blue lake above didn't begin until after the kingdom collapsed. So unless the capital was originally named by some edgy literature student, the name City of Tears wouldn't have made much sense. The king's motivation for all this appears to have been his desire to be worshipped. The citizens of Hallownest believe that the Pale King created the world, and everything in it. Shrines to the king can be found scattered throughout the kingdom, and king's idols were created
Ah, c'est vrai que quand tu regardes, juste quand tu regardes cette image et que quand tu joues, tu prêtes pas forcément attention au fond et tout, c'est incroyable. Et du coup, et oui, la pluie vient du lac qui fuit. Et en vrai, ça aussi c'est marrant, tu vois. C'est des petits détails comme ça, mais c'est vrai que c'est marrant de s'en rendre vraiment compte.
and distributed to followers of the king. Despite the worship, the Pale King often kept himself hidden from his subjects, possibly to hide his blemishes. I mean, if you look at the size of the real Pale King to his statue in the ancient basin, the man is clearly overcompensating. The Pale King's White Palace was also built underneath the city, separating him from his subjects even more so. At the same time, certain powers became shunned in Hallownest, though we don't know for sure if the Pale King had anything to do with this. Lifeblood is a blue liquidy substance that leaves those who drink it feeling refreshed. However, the use of lifeblood was seen as a taboo, and those who used it were demonized as heretics. The use of soul for combat was also shunned. Soul is a sort of life force in Hollow Knight that animates the bodies of living creatures. But some characters are able to control the soul of others to conjure powerful spirits. But aside from a few exceptions, no citizens of Hallownest ever use this power. However, the Pale King didn't rule alone. There was another higher being in the mix.
Je l'ai découvert très tard.
The White Lady.
The White Lady
is a weird brute-like being that can be found in the modern-day Queen's Gardens.
Donc ça, je l'ai trouvé assez tard aussi.
She's in a strange cocoon, and we know very little about her.
Ok.
With as much exposition we get for the Pale King, there is next to nothing on the White Lady. But one thing we do know is that she likes to breed. Like, a lot. The White Lady would often retreat to the Queen's Gardens, an area of land once controlled by the Mosskin. How exactly she walked around and actually went places is a lore question too deep for even my expertise. The White Lady is also known as a pale being, along with the Pale King.
Ouais, normal,
What exactly
normal.
are pale beings? Well, we don't know for sure, but they seem to stand out even amongst higher beings, as being even more powerful.
Ouais, en mode pâle est égal. Être pâle est égal à être supérieur.
Let's try using an example. I'd say that regular higher beings are like a TP Link Archer C7 AC1750 wireless dual band gigabit
à quel moment c'est plus
pale beings are like the Asus RT-AX88U AX6000 dual band 8X gigabit Wi-Fi router. Under the Pale King, Hallownest underwent a bit of an industrial revolution.
Non, là, non, en même temps, il a pas tort. C'est vrai que là, maintenant, c'est vraiment beaucoup plus clair par rapport à sa phrase précédente. Donc, non, il a vraiment pas tort. C'est bien. C'est très très bien. Non, parce que c'est vrai qu'entre ça et ça, bon, bah là, du coup, tu vois à quel point ça a évolué, quoi. Donc, il y a les êtres supérieurs et il y a les êtres pâles. Pâles et pas peau, hein.
Under the Pale King, Hallownest underwent a bit of an industrial revolution.
Révolution industrielle, bien sûr, des coléoptères.
Which were used to transport passengers and goods.
Bien sûr.
The Forgotten Crossroads and the storerooms above the City of Tears were used to store goods that traveled along these stagways. The king also ordered the construction of the tramways, because literally no one is safe from the threat of automation. A tram was built between the Forgotten Crossroads.
C'est vrai que ça, cette partie-là du tram, c'est quand même chelou. Hein. T'es là en mode, oui, bon bah du coup, il y a un tram. C'est-à-dire qu'on se bat face à des abeilles et des asticots, mais par contre, il y a le tram et il y a des coléoptères qui t'amènent d'un point A à un point B. Mais tranquille. Tranquille, on n'est pas là pour juger. Les êtres 3G et les êtres 5G, ouais, exactement.
Across the ancient basin over to Deepnest.
Ouais.
And then a third tram was started in Deepnest and attempted to go further into Deepnest. Not sure how useful that would have been to the bugs of Hallownest, but whatever. The Pale King's a smart guy. I'm not gonna question him. But anyway, the Pale King's super smart plan to build a tram in Deepnest ended up getting a few of his tram workers killed.
Ouais.
The bugs of Deepnest rejected the Pale King's attempt to build a tram in their territory, further cementing the poor relations shared between
Deepnest, ils ont pas envie de se faire maltraiter. Hein.
Convenient fast travel, regular pathways were also used to cart goods around the kingdom. From this was born probably one of the most important groups in Hallownest, and perhaps even all of fiction. An elusive guild of bugs, simply known as the Menderbugs, took to maintaining the various signs scattered throughout Hallownest.
Très très important.
From the journal entry of one Menderbug, we can catch a glimpse into their ancient
très
unknowable minds.
Dear, dear diary, isn't life just the most beautiful thing? Fixing signs, mending posts, let them break, I say. I'm a better mender for all that repairing. I sometimes doubt there's a single bug in all of Hallownest happier than me.
Another example of the Pale King's expanding infrastructure is the Crystal Peak.
C'est vrai que le mont cristal, c'est assez particulier aussi.
Grow rapidly along walls, ceilings, and even the shells of certain bugs. These crystals were considered valuable to the bugs of Hallownest, resulting in large-scale mining efforts. We don't actually see the crystals used anywhere else in Hallownest, but they are said to contain a sort of energy. The crystals are also said to sing. If you
C'est vrai que quand je vois ça, les cristaux, quand je suis arrivé au Mont Cristal, j'étais en mode what the fuck, est-ce que ça va être une nouvelle monnaie, est-ce qu'on peut récupérer des choses de ça? Et en fait tu traverses la zone et t'es en mode bon bah c'est une zone un peu comme toutes les autres, donc c'est pas, y a rien de plus, tu peux les casser, tu peux les taper, mais c'est vrai que c'est une zone qui renferme pas, enfin qui renferme beaucoup de secrets je trouve, et pas grand chose de compréhensible quand t'arrives dedans quoi. Les coléoptères c'est des calèches en gros, à l'honnête t'as des trucs qui rappellent l'électricité, ils ont une tech environ des années 1800. Bah... Même le tramway du coup ou pas?
listen very carefully. In terms of military, Hallownest's first line of defense appeared to be a group simply known as the Five Great Knights.
Okay.
The members of this esteemed coalition were Ogrim,
Oui.
Hegemol, Zamir, Drya, and Isma.
Ok.
For being so important, most of the information about these knights has been lost to time.
Cool.
Ogrim is the knight we know the most about, since
Bien
he is
sûr.
one of the few knights still alive during the events of the game. Ogrim expressed
On l'a
a great
fumé,
amount
Ogrim.
of loyalty towards the king, and he maybe had something going on with Isma,
Okay.
but we really don't know.
Okay.
Hegemol was known for his sense of humor and his soft-spoken voice, but at the same time, he was also dummy thick. Mysterious Samir arrived in
Dummy
Hallownest from a
thick.
serene land, bringing with her a collection of delicate flowers. At some point, she also got into a relationship with a mantis, but not just
D'accord.
any mantis, a daughter of one of the mantis lords. So yeah,
Big boy.
it seems like these great knights were slaying in more ways than one. All we really know about Drya is that she was fierce, caring, and wise.
Ok.
As for Isma, she was described as being kind. She also appears to be some sort of weird plant life form, but there's no information on
Bah
what
là
she's
oui,
from or
c'est
what her powers
peut-être
were.
la seule chose qu'on peut dire
The
là pour
Five
le
Great
coup.
Knights play an important role in the Champion's Call, the Knotted Grove, and the Battle of the Blackworm.
Ok.
We have no idea what these events were or how they affected Hallownest, but they sound cool nonetheless.
Ouais, donc il y a une
During
part de
Hallownest's
mystère
reign,
encore derrière ça
there
quoi.
was another strange area that seemed to exist separate from the Pale King's rule. Carved out of the corpse of an ancient bug, an area called the Colosseum of Fools was constructed, and it was a destination for warriors from outside Hallownest.
On connaît.
The sole purpose for fighting in the Colosseum appeared to be simple.
Oui, je crois que au Grim c'est ça qui s'est passé, ouais. C'est que la phase 2 on l'a jamais eu parce que j'ai fait un truc chelou et j'ai cancel sa phase 2 et donc du coup je l'ai tué sans ça. Ouais. C'est vrai, c'est vrai, c'est vrai. La seule récompense des jeux du Colisée semble être uniquement la gloire.
For glory,
Un petit peu de
with a
géo, ok.
mysterious figure known as the Lord Fool overseeing the combat.
Ouais.
We don't know when the Colosseum was constructed or if the Pale King was involved, but one of his servants, the Pale Lurker,
Ah.
became a champion in the Colosseum, perhaps indicating the Pale King's approval. And finally, there was the Royal Waterways, where the fecal excrement of the kingdom was washed out into the fungal wastes. This area saw the rise of a species of parasite-like creatures called the flukes. The flukes
Je
spawned
les
from the
déteste.
fluke
Non mais
moth,
vraiment.
a giant monster with cavities
Je
in
pense
which
que c'est
tinier
vraiment parmi les
flukes
pires
live.
monstres de tout
There
Hollow
really
Knight.
isn't too much lore
là.
involved with the flukes, but I do need to point
Eux
out
qui
that
marchent,
the
là.
fluke marm is canonically a MILF. Like, that's not even debatable. The sky is blue, 2 + 2 = 4, and we all want to fuck this thing. And so this was the kingdom of Hallownest at its height. Hallownest was a vast kingdom connected by a network of stagways and tram stations. The bugs of Hallownest mourned their dead on the resting grounds, engaged in commerce using Geo, the de facto currency of the region,
Bien sûr.
and a thriving capital located in the middle of the kingdom.
Bien
The Pale
sûr.
King had succeeded in crafting a full-blown society, but we all know there are pitfalls to living in a society. As a suspiciously knowledgeable hunter points out in his journal, the Pale King had created a population of weak and pathetic creatures. The bugs of Hallownest
No.
did not hunt for their own food, and had become complacent with their comfort. This is even more obvious with the east wing of the capital. These greedy members of Hallownest's high society became complete cowards, obsessed with riches and plumb from excess wealth. The bugs living in Hallownest Prime looked quite different than the instinctive simpletons they once were. Their savagery had been replaced with intelligence.
Ouais, lui il
and through
m'intrigue.
that intellect, they gave the Pale King
Lui il
the
m'intrigue du
devotion
coup
and
parce que je l'ai pas
service
croisé
he
encore.
desired. And while there were a few snags along the way, they were shining times for the king and his subjects. Resting at the threshold of Halonest is a strange lore tablet, claiming Halonest to be the last and only civilization. It calls Halonest an eternal kingdom.
C'est vrai, je m'en souviens de ça.
This appears to have been the Pale King's goal, for Halonest to stand against a wasted world as a final beacon for civilization.
Ok, ouais.
And that was the Pale King's ultimate folly, to think that he could succeed where so many others had failed before. Long before the Pale Kings or the Barry Bensons of the world, the land of Halonest was controlled by an ancient caste. Hints of Halonest history are littered throughout the land, with the most notable examples being the soul totems and arcane eggs.
Okay.
One sect of these ancient bugs didn't worship a god like the Pale King or any lord, but instead a dark and mysterious substance known as the Void.
Ouais.
This ancient caste once also tried to lay claim to the entire land of Halonest, but they too failed. In his quest to conquer all of Halonest, the Pale King had made an enemy long forgotten, an enemy that was about to be remembered.
Et c'est vrai que vite fait, parce que là il en a parlé un petit peu avant, mais c'est les œufs arcaniques qui sont comment dire, l'espèce de truc que tu peux donner aux marchands et qui te rapporte le plus de géo là. Et c'était un truc assez mystérieux ça, parce qu'encore les journaux d'aventuriers, etc., il y avait une certaine logique, tu vois. Mais c'est vrai que c'était vraiment mystérieux, je trouve, pour cette partie-là, parce que on en a eu que très peu, ça se vendait bien plus cher, il n'y avait pas forcément d'explication derrière. Et je sais pas, peut-être qu'il va en parler un petit peu plus après, mais je trouvais que c'était un objet que tu pouvais récupérer qui était assez mystérieux, quoi.
I mentioned earlier that the Moth tribe entirely forgot about the Radiance in order to worship the Pale King, but that isn't quite true. Memories of her still lingered, and hushed whispers of faith kept the Radiance alive.
Okay.
At the summit of the Crystal Peak, a location known as Halonest Crown,
seulement 4 dans tout Halonest.
Collection of glyphs can be found. Joining these glyphs is a...
Oui, alors d'ailleurs avec ces glyphes là, on peut pas interacter avec, donc on sait pas si ça dit des choses ou pas.
Statue of the Radiance, presiding over the kingdom below. This old summit is the sole standing shrine left to the Radiance.
Okay.
This was built in order to keep the memory of the Radiance alive. The Radiance's light began to appear in the dreams of Halonest citizens. This light manifested itself in an infection that ravaged through the kingdom's tunnels.
Ah, ça vient de ça. Mais alors par contre, moi je n'arrive pas à me souvenir quelle est la chose que j'ai fait dans le jeu qui a justement déclenché et débloqué toute cette infection là. Parce que du coup, au tout début du jeu, quand tu le démarres, c'est pas le cas. Il y a pas tous ces globes oranges, etc. Tu vois. Et j'arrive pas à me souvenir. C'est quand tu tues le premier rêveur. Avoir les ailes de monarque. En débloquant le double saut du coup. Avec un rêveur ou les ailes de monarque. Ok, mais pourquoi? Intéressant. Ok, intéressant. Bon, on va voir, peut-être qu'il va en parler justement.
Those infected would fall into a deep sleep and awaken with broken minds.
Ouais.
Some of the lesser bugs tried to resist the Radiance's light, which only resulted in them being consumed by it even more so. Many infected bugs lost their wills and began attacking bugs that weren't infected. The infection also twisted the bodies of its hosts, causing them to bloat and occasionally develop orange cysts on their bodies.
Ouais.
For many victims, they were reverted back to their basic instincts, carrying out the duties they once fulfilled in life, but now as mindless slaves.
Un peu en tant que
Those
garde.
caught up in the infection were linked into the Radiance's hive mind, allowing her to control their bodies if needed. As the infection spread across Halonest, many groups looked to solutions to fight off the Radiance's light. The gates to the City of Tears were closed in an attempt to keep the infection from reaching the city.
Oh oui,
The
ok.
stagways were also shut down at some point, and many of the stags eventually died out, but some took more proactive efforts against the infection. The scholars of the Soul Sanctum decided to harness the power of Soul in an attempt to fight the infection. This resulted in the deaths of hundreds of bugs.
Putain, ça servait à ça. Parce que j'avoue que pareil, quand t'étais là-dedans, bon, t'étais en mode oui, il y a de l'âme dans des bocaux en l'air, quoi. Il y a de l'âme dans des lampadaires, ça fait de la lumière, c'est quand même très joli. Mais alors du coup, ça servait à ça. Très marrant. L2 Monarque, tu combats le vaisseau corrompu qui est plein d'infections, c'est mon hypothèse. Et un rêveur, le temple est moins hermétique, moins bien scellé, ça s'échappe et ça contamine les routes. Intéressant en vrai. C'est rigolo que le mec qui a le double saut ne l'utilise pas. De quoi? Ah, le mec qui a le double saut ne l'utilise pas. Oui, d'accord, en fait, oui, tu le lootes sur lui, mais lui il ne l'a pas en tant que tel, quoi, peut-être. Oui, je pense que c'est un peu ça aussi, quoi. Mais oui, c'est vrai que le monstre qui te le file pourrait très bien l'utiliser lui-même aussi, tu vois. Mais en effet, c'est pas... C'est après lui et c'est pas sur lui.
The infection.
Ok.
This resulted in the deaths of hundreds of bugs.
Ah, ça on a bien vu, ouais, dans les abysses.
Into the bodies of the scholars.
Et pas que.
Their goal was to achieve some kind of pure focus, which would somehow protect them from plagues of the mind. The scholar's leader, the Soul Master, was driven mad by the sheer power of Soul.
Enfer.
And his entire sect failed to avoid infection.
Ok.
But hey, at least they took as many innocent people down with them as they could. The Mantis tribe, showing a stronger will than the common bug, were able to stave off the infection.
Ok, donc les
However,
mantes.
one of the four Mantis lords turned against his sisters.
Oui.
He and his followers took in the infection willingly, as it gave them more strength and courage. At some point during all this, the traitor lord and his followers were exiled from the Mantis village, eventually taking up residence in the Queen's Gardens. The traitor lord's daughter ended up dying at some point. This is the same Mantis that was in a relationship with Zemir, one of the 5 great knights.
Oui,
but the Mantises rejected their union because of Zemir's outsideness.
Ok.
As a gamer, this type of prejudice is all too familiar, and honestly, it makes me sick. With the 5 great knights completely useless to fight against the infection, the Pale King devised his own scheme. A scheme involving a strange substance known as Void.
Ouais, ok.
As I mentioned earlier, the Pale King's White Palace was built in an area called the Ancient Basin.
Ouais.
His castle wasn't the only noteworthy thing down there.
Bien sûr.
At the bottom of the Ancient Basin was the entrance to a pit.
Les abysses.
The Abyss.
Alors, d'ailleurs, dans les abysses, avant même qu'on en parle dans la vidéo, vous le savez que tout en haut à gauche des abysses, il y a une porte avec un espèce de piédestal, enfin, même pas forcément indiqué comme ça, mais comme un espèce d'éléments dans lequel on pourrait peut-être mettre quelque chose pour pouvoir ouvrir cette fameuse porte. Ça, je l'ai pas fait. Il y avait plein de gens dans le chat qui étaient en mode ça m'a pris super longtemps, je comprenais pas du tout ce qu'il fallait faire et tout, mais ouais, avec cette fameuse porte bleue. Donc ça aussi, c'est l'un des autres secrets que j'irai voir plus tard. Mais je sais pas qu'est-ce qui permet de l'ouvrir ou pas, à quoi ça amène, je n'en sais rien.
Within the abyss was a lake composed of void.
Ouais, le lac.
The Pale King realized that
void.
this void could be given form, as evidenced by an imprint of such deep within the abyss, possibly left there by the ancient civilization that predated Halonest.
Les points bleus là.
The Pale King devised a workshop in his palace where he placed void.
Ah, mais peut-être que la solution. Non, en vrai, ce serait trop chiant. J'allais dire, est-ce que ce serait pas d'aller chercher tous les nids bleus et ensuite de s'y rendre? Mais c'est insupportable. J'étais en mode, est-ce qu'il y a un lien parce que c'est le seul truc qui est bleu? Mais en vrai, je pense pas. En fait, je pense qu'il y a même pas forcément de lien avec ça. Mais voilà. Mais après, de toute manière, en soi, enfin comment dire, on va sûrement l'apprendre dans la vidéo, je pense. Mais en soi, même si je l'apprends pas dans la vidéo, on pourra en parler parce que comme je vous dis, ça c'est plutôt la partie où je vais pas aller chercher dans le jeu en fait. Justement par rapport à ce que tu dis Phoenix, moi je vais faire exactement tout l'inverse de ça. C'est-à-dire que je serais content de les comprendre, enfin de les connaître et de les faire. Mais ce sera pas en mettant 50 heures de jeu à chercher, en gros. C'est des trucs où je me spoilerai probablement dessus. Après à voir, peut-être que la vidéo en parlera. On en reparle à la fin de la vidéo.
Servants known as King's molds and wing molds. These void creatures were somehow imprinted with the desire of the Pale King, so that they would serve him. It isn't clear when the Pale King started making these creatures.
Ok.
There is evidence to imply that even common bugs were aware of King's molds. But the point is, the Pale King turned to the void in order to create another creature, one that he believed could contain the radiance and her infection. He tried to create a pure vessel.
Ah, on y vient.
Radiance's infection.
Non, parce que le vaisseau pur, j'en sais rien. J'imagine. J'imagine un vaisseau de SpaceX, quoi. J'imagine pas forcément une créature. Tu vois ce que je veux dire? Donc du coup, ça, je suis très curieux.
Needs its host to have a will and a mind in order to enslave it. A pure vessel would be a creature made of void, designed to lack those features. The Pale King believed that by harnessing the void inside a pure vessel, he would be able to stop the infection and keep Hallownest lasting eternal. But his method for creating this so-called pure vessel was incredibly cruel. This is where the White Lady and her King Kong-sized libido come into play. These two higher beings engaged in a union of some kind, resulting in the creation of several eggs that were dropped down into the abyss. There, the void seeped into these eggs, corrupting the offspring of the Pale King and the White Lady. This act resulted in the creation of the vessels. The vessels are not technically considered to be alive. They are shells created from the Pale King and White Lady that have been filled with the void. Within each vessel is a shade, a completely void being hidden behind the face of the vessel. Vessels are also non-gendered, I guess because they're dead or something. I'm not sure if that's how that works, but whatever. I'm not an expert on these kinds of things. I don't work at ICE anymore. Thousands of vessels were created during this process, but only one was chosen as the pure vessel. This particular vessel, chosen by the Pale King, was deemed the Hollow Knight, and was taken away to the White Palace. But I want to take a bit of a closer look at this part of the story. There are a number of questions and...
Ah, moi je pensais que c'était Zot, le vaisseau pur. Je suis trop deg. Il aurait trop mérité. Il y a un certain nombre de questions et de théories autour de ce moment. Ah mais ça, oui, ça c'est incroyable. Cette zone, enfin ce moment-là du jeu, j'étais en mode, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Genre vraiment, je comprenais pas.
Theories surrounding this moment that I really want to dig into. The big question surrounding this moment is, why was the Hollow Knight chosen over any other vessel? One common theory is that the Pale King took these vessels back to the White Palace and evaluated them using his giant collection of buzzsaws. This theory is probably the least likely explanation. It kinda exists just to explain the buzzsaws, which is quite the mystery, I'll admit, but...
C'est vrai que Zot, en fait, la manière dont les gens en parlaient dans le chat, j'avais vraiment l'impression que ça allait être le boss final, quoi. Genre vraiment tout le monde était là en mode, mec, quand tu vas croiser Zot, mais c'est... Genre tu te rends pas encore compte en fait à quel point... C'est vraiment, tu te rends pas compte à quel point le jeu commence vraiment une fois que tu vois Zot, quoi. Et puis là j'ai vu Zot et je me suis dit... Ah, bon, ok.
It doesn't really mesh with the vessels very well.
Ce sera le boss final de Silksong, c'est sûr. C'est sûr. C'est sûr. Il y a aucune chance que ce soit pas le cas. C'est 100% sûr.
How does being good at Super Meat Boy prove that you are a worthy vessel? And while thinking about logistics in a game about magic bugs is never a good idea, how exactly did the Pale King transfer these thousands of vessels to his palace without characters like the Dung Defender finding out? So this means that the Pale King probably made his decision without taking any of the vessels out of the abyss.
Ah, peut-être, oui.
So how did the Pale King make his evaluation? I think the best explanation comes from a theory I originally heard from a user named Golden Flower Fan.
Okay.
Basically, the vessels were hatched down at the bottom of the abyss, and the first one to make it to the top was chosen by the Pale King.
Ah, peut-être.
In memory of this event, we see vessels falling from above
back
down into the pit of the abyss.
Ouais.
Perhaps these vessels weren't being cast down.
C'est un peu... ça me fait penser au film 300 avec l'épreuve des jeunes Spartiates, quoi. C'est un peu celui qui arrive à atteindre le haut sera vraiment considéré en tant qu'égal. Mais bon, c'est vrai que c'est un peu... comment dire? À voir, attends.
Into the abyss, but fell while trying to escape out of it. The lore tablet outside the abyss appears to support this theory. It reads, "Our pure vessel has ascended. Beyond lies only the refuse and regret of its creation. We shall enter that place no longer." This tablet was likely written right after the Hollow Knight was chosen, considering that is when the entrance to the abyss was sealed off.
j'avoue que j'allais dire, c'est un peu tiré par les cheveux, c'est un peu trop facile. J'étais en mode, c'est peut-être un peu trop facile de juste se dire, oh ben il y a des cadavres, donc du coup c'est celui qui a été choisi. Mais j'avoue que la tablette par contre elle dit ça quasiment texto quoi. Comme ça que je comprends la scène de l'ascension. Ah oui, c'est ta théorie aussi quand elle aime. En fait c'est plus la tablette que le reste qui l'explique, je trouve. Mais ouais, ok, ouais.
The tablet proclaims that the pure vessel has ascended, or in other words, climbed out of the abyss.
Ouais.
And while cut content should never be considered canon, I would just like to point out that an earlier version of this tablet, found in the game's code, was even more explicit about this.
Ok.
It read, "From below, our pure vessel has ascended." But how does making it to the top of the abyss first prove that the Hollow Knight is somehow a perfectly hollow vessel? Well, I think this whole concept might just be a misconception.
Ok.
What if the Hollow Knight wasn't any different from the other vessels? All the vessels were made in the exact same way after all. The idea that the Hollow Knight was somehow more hollow than the other vessels comes from the fact that there were so many vessels created in the first place. If they only needed one, then why create so goddamn many? I mean, this is like Octomom on steroids. Well, these are bugs we're talking about, so it would make sense that multiple offspring would come from one egg. And it might have been a precaution to produce multiple vessels in hopes that at least one would be able to successfully escape the abyss.
Bah, vu à quel point ça avait l'air galère de monter les abysses, finalement ils ont peut-être bien fait. Hein. Finalement ils ont peut-être bien fait quoi. Ouais, bah, vous avez le lien de Watigua. Bon, moi je la regarderai pas hein, du coup, mais je la regarderai pas parce que je suis déjà sur une vidéo. Mais vous avez un lien d'une vidéo annexe. Après, je pense que voilà, des vidéos qui parlent de lore, il y en a toujours certaines qui vont avoir des détails sur un élément du lore plus que d'autres et tout. Et c'est bien pour ça d'ailleurs que la vidéo que je suis en train de regarder, c'est l'histoire quasiment complète de Hollow Knight parce que voilà.
Now another explanation could be that the Pale King just yeeted other vessels that made it to the top first, after determining that they weren't hollow, which would better explain why so many were created. Ultimately, the exact details aren't super important, but I do find it interesting how many different interpretations can be pulled from this part of the lore.
Ouais.
After
Réel.
the Hollow Knight was
Je suis
chosen,
d'accord.
the Pale King sealed the doorway to the abyss, leaving the
Parce que
discarded
YouTube
vessels
fait
to
des
rot away in
traductions.
darkness. These
Automatique.
actions were not taken lightly by the Pale King or the White Lady. Both participants expressed shame in what they did, but saw no other option to save the kingdom. But the vessels weren't the only poor saps sealed away in the abyss. There's also a lighthouse that was built on top of a naturally formed
oui, c'est vrai.
spire.
C'est vrai,
Its
c'est vrai.
light shining down on an ocean of abyss below. Inside was one of the Pale King's royal retainers, who was left in charge of keeping the lighthouse turned on. So this brave soul was willingly sealed in a dark and dangerous tomb for the rest of his life, just so he could not pull a lever. Well, at least he was living with purpose. With the abyss sealed and the Hollow Knight chosen, the Pale King's plan was beginning to come together. The Hollow Knight was raised and trained to prime form, causing it to grow several times its original size.
C'est tellement bâtard pour le petit qui est resté dans son phare là. Le pauvre, quelle vie de merde.
We don't know exactly why this happened, but I guess the Hollow Knight is just a grower and not a shower. We know that the Hollow Knight was trained to use a nail, but why was this even necessary?
Attends. C'est quoi ça? Je suis en train de regarder quoi là?
Possible explanation is that
Parce que moi j'ai...
the Hollow Knight is just a grower and not a shower. We know that the Hollow Knight was trained to use a nail, but why was this even necessary? One possible
DLC, ok.
explanation is that the Hollow Knight needed to protect itself
Ok. Très bien,
in
très bien.
case an intruder tried to kill it. You know, like the player.
Ah, c'est juste que je l'ai pas trouvé quoi. C'est juste que je l'ai pas trouvé. Ouais, j'ai pas trouvé ça. Ouais, intéressant. Ah, mais tant mieux, ça veut dire que j'ai des boss à faire.
Or perhaps this was important in the process of containing the Radiance. Unfortunately, the details of that are never fully explained. The Hollow Knight might have somehow focused the Radiance inside itself, but Team Cherry gives us no explanation of how that might have worked. But that still wasn't enough for the Pale King. Additional seals were needed in order to protect the Hollow Knight's physical body,
Ouais.
while the Radiance
Ah, les
was
veilleurs,
trapped
du coup.
inside of it. To achieve this, the Pale King sought the help of 3 particular bugs, who would later be known as the Dreamers. Lurien the Watcher,
Ah, les rêveurs, c'est vrai.
Motomon the Teacher, and Hera the Beast.
Ouais, ouais, ok.
Lurien is definitely the most mysterious of the three dreamers. He lived in the Watcher's Spire in the City of Tears. From there, Lurien watched over the city with his telescope. Lurien was a pretty big fan of the king, so it probably took little convincing for him to lie down for him. Lurien might also be tied to another strange incident that occurred in the City of Tears. Hidden on some of Lurien's lore tablets are images of jars, the same jars that can be found stockpiled in the Tower of Love.
Ok.
This building sits on the outskirts of the city, and is the setting of one of the most bizarre bosses in the game, the Collector. The Collector is a void construct
Ah, je pense
that
qu'on
appears to have been made from the
je pense
same
qu'on est bien
mold
d'accord.
used to create the King's molds. But the Collector
Pour
is
dire que c'est le
unique
plus bizarre, je pense
because,
qu'on est bien d'accord.
well,
Good grief, he's naked!
the Collector stayed in the Tower of Love with a noble bug who likely owned the establishment. In the tower, a number of bugs can be found captured in jars,
Ouais.
implying that these two were tasked with collecting these creatures. However, the Collector somehow became obsessed with grubs, creating a map to keep track of grubs it captured in jars,
Ouais.
as well as keeping a strange shrine displaying a
Oh,
grub
wow,
in
la
the
tablette est
style
trop
of the
stylée.
Vitruvian man. Eventually, the bug staying with the Collector decided to lock it inside the Tower of Love, and fled to the Queen's Gardens, where it died, likely due to overexposure to the void. Despite being locked
me souviens
up
pas
in
de ce
the
cadavre.
tower, the Collector is still spotted by the Hunter at some point, which either means this only happened recently, or the Hunter has been farting around in Halonest for a long-ass time. We have no idea what these creatures were trying to do. It's implied that the Collector was trying to preserve the creatures of Halonest, perhaps trying to protect them from the spread of the infection, but we don't know where the Collector's obsession with grubs originated. And while Lurien does seem connected to all of this, we don't know how involved he was with this operation, or what its end goal exactly was.
J'ai bien dit, on parle de niveau
Modem on the
d'implication
teacher
des
lived in the teacher's
personnages.
archives, a
Ça me
library
fait-
built atop a lake of acid in the Fog
Ouais,
Canyon.
ah, ça on se souvient
The lower
plutôt bien.
half of her body consists of tentacles, making her a popular subject for the thriving Hollow Knight R34 community. The archives and the Fog Canyon as a whole are also filled with these strange Metroid knockoffs. These creatures are likely related to Monomon in some way.
Un enfer
They
aussi.
could be her live offspring, her test tube babies,
Un enfer,
or
ces
possibly
tentacules.
even her shit. Motomon uses futuristic cathode ray tube things to store information about Halonest.
Ok.
Several terminals in the teacher's archive go into detail about the Pale King's plan to defeat the Radiants, indicating that Motomon had intimate knowledge of what she was taking part in. Finally, the Pale King sought the help of Hera the Beast, the Queen of Deep Nest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, relations between Halonest and Deep Nest were kinda not great. Unlike the other two dreamers, Hera needed to be convinced in order to help the Pale
Ok,
King.
ok.
Hera would eventually agree to become a dreamer, in exchange for a child. The Pale King agreed, and the two engaged in a dalliance, which is a fancy way of saying they totally boned. The White Lady was okay with this arrangement. In fact,
ok.
she might have been watching
Ça
from
va,
the
alors.
closet. The
Oh,
motive
ça
behind Hera's request is never elaborated on, but it appears as though the King of Deep Nest was dead at this point. Hera was a common bug, so perhaps she desired the Pale King's pale seed so that her child could be of high birth.
Ouais.
The bargain
Du coup, c'est
between
qui?
Hera and the Pale King resulted in the birth of Hornet. She became known as the gendered child.
Non
because
mais vraiment. Non mais vraiment. C'est de ça qu'elle provient. Mister F, bonjour. Ouah, d'accord. Ok. Donc, là, parce que c'est important, parce que aussi si on regarde tout ça, c'est pour préparer Silksong, vous le savez, vous savez. Donc moi j'ai des choses à comprendre, tu vois. Hornet, ouais, c'est ta demi-sœur. Donc Hornet est ma demi-sœur, donc c'est un peu pour ça qu'elle m'aide aussi, tu vois.
Because unlike the Pale King's other children, Hornet was not hollowed out by the Abyss.
Ouais.
Hera and Hornet spent little time together, as Hera had to make good on her end of the bargain. And so the three dreamers were put to rest.
Ok.
Through their actions, a seal was placed over the black egg, prohibiting entrance into the chamber. These dreamers also had their own protection. At the base of Lurien's spire, the Watcher Knights guarded access to their master's body. Motomon's body was protected by a giant jellyfish named Umu.
Ah oui, c'est vrai.
On top of this,
Qui servait
Motomon
complètement à
entrusted
rien.
her servant Quirrell with a mask which would be required to break an additional
c'est vrai.
seal she had placed over herself. So she basically is double wrapping herself. As for Hera, we're not really sure what protected her, since it is never actually seen in-game. We don't know where this creature is hiding, but whoever it is, they really suck at their job. Now there appears to be one more element to the Pale King's plan, involving the Weavers.
Ok.
Hidden away in the Weaver's den is an incomplete seal of binding, woven from silk. This design prominently features the Hollow Knight's head, and can be found in the White Palace, as well as blocking the exit during the Hollow Knight fight.
Ah, ça c'est stylé hein, comme
Silk
détail. Hein.
spools created by the Weavers can be found in the Stag Station in Deep Nest, as well as the Stag Station next to the White Palace. These spools can also be found in the Pale King's workshop. We know that the Weavers were closely tied to Hera and Hornet, so their actions might have been a part of the deal between the Pale King and Hera. Once the Hollow Knight was ready, the Radiance was somehow channeled into the vessel, which was then placed inside of a giant black egg located in the Forgotten Crossroads.
Okay.
This egg was
D'ailleurs
built
un
to
élément
sustain the Hollow
qu'on
Knight,
croise très
and
tôt dans le
itself
jeu,
appears
hein,
to be
donc.
fashioned from void. The Hollow Knight was chained up, and the entrance to the black egg
Ouais,
was
Silk
locked
Song,
behind
hein,
a
enfin, c'est
powerful
vrai.
seal created by the three dreamers. Initially, this convoluted plan actually worked, and the infection was successfully contained.
Ok.
Memorials to the Hollow Knight and the Dreamers were erected in the City of Tears and the Resting Grounds. But this is the part of the story where things get a little bit hazy. By the time these statues were constructed, citizens had taken to writing on parchment woven from spider silk, which was all destroyed when water started pouring down onto the city. We don't know how long the Hollow Knight was able to completely contain the infection. Bugs from Dirtmouth used to go to the Temple of the Black Egg to pray, saying they felt at peace within the walls. But after a while, they stopped going, perhaps indicating that the infection was beginning to leak out again. The infectious air continued to seep through Halnest for years, eventually even reaching the deepest parts of the kingdom.
Ouais.
As it turns out, the Pale King's pure vessel wasn't quite so pure after all. The Hollow Knight had been tarnished by an idea instilled. While the game never explicitly tells us what that idea was, it does hint strongly at what it might be. Hidden away in the White Palace is a memory showing the Hollow Knight and the Pale King sharing a moment. The Hollow Knight might have developed a parental bond to the Pale King, and who could blame it? The Pale King is a pretty great dad after all. You know, if you ignore the infanticide and everything.
Ouais, faut ignorer
Remember
certaines
those
choses.
smug mushroom dickheads?
Faut,
Well, it turns out their trust in the Pale King
faut
was a
vraiment ignorer
complete
certaines
mistake.
choses.
That shared mind isn't looking too good now, is it? In the fungal core, the corpse of a giant mushroom lies dormant.
Encore,
Its
hein.
final thoughts were, "Pale worm, what good to see a demise unavoidable?" This could imply that the Pale King always knew that his kingdom was doomed.
Ouais.
All he could do was delay the inevitable. This is likely
Éviter l'inévitable et potentiellement essayer de créer des connexions amicales aussi avec certains membres justement du royaume pour être sûr que ça aille dans le bon sens et pas que ce soit le foutoir quoi. Peut-être, mais bon. Je sais pas.
the moment when Halnest, as it once was, entirely collapsed. The Hollow Knight had not completely stopped the infection, and while it may have taken a while, Halnest was eventually brought low.
Ouais.
It's at this point that characters and areas begin to resemble as we know them in-game.
Ouais, ok.
When
Ok,
it
ok.
became clear that the Hollow
Oui, parce que là, on va pas se mentir que finalement, on a eu une espèce de gigantesque introduction à comment le monde a évolué jusqu'à ce que nous, on joue, quoi. Parce qu'en vrai, même la partie où il y a l'infection, on y arrive quand même assez tôt dans le jeu, donc on vit avec pendant pas mal de temps, quoi.
Knight was not able to contain the Radiance, the Pale King resorted to his final plan. He fucked off, hiding himself, his White Palace, and his Pale Court in the Dream World. At this point, all of the furniture in the palace was covered under white
Ouais,
sheets,
c'est vrai.
similar to how people in the real
Ouais, c'est ça.
world cover their furniture while away on long trips. The palace was also completely covered with thorns and buzzsaws, similar to how people in the real world cover their houses with thorns and buzzsaws.
Oh putain, je m'attendais pas du tout. Trop chiant. Bah du coup non, personne fait ça en fait. Enfin, ok.
The Pale King would eventually pass away while sitting on his throne in the White Palace. There's no confirmation on what killed him, but there are a few things to consider.
Alors tout ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que moi je me souviens de ce gros coup que je lui ai mis sur la tête quand je suis arrivé au palace, mais tranquille.
The throne room is incredibly dark compared to the rest of the palace, and the particle effects and ambient track in this room are identical to that of the Abyss.
Ouais.
All of the king's molds surrounding the Pale King are dead.
Ouais.
The ancient basin itself also has become stained with the presence of void, as it can be seen as high as the rundown elevator shaft leading back to the city.
Ouais.
Remember that bug that was sealed away in the Abyss to make sure the lighthouse wasn't turned off? Well, the lighthouse was turned off.
Ouais.
I guess that whole living with purpose thing is a crock of shit after all. It seems as though the Sea of Void itself actually convinced this bug to betray his king and turn off the lighthouse. Now I know what you're thinking. Exactly how conscious is the Void? Is the Void able to think for
C'est vrai qu'il y a vraiment des endroits du Void justement qui paraissent extrêmement vivants, tu vois, et pas juste une énergie de couleur noire qui fait pas grand chose, quoi. On sent que il y a certaines zones justement où on sait pas vers quoi ça pourrait aller vraiment, quoi. Du coup, Quen avait dit plutôt qu'une relation père-fils, j'ai interprété le retour de la radiance et l'imperfection d'Hollow Knight comme une conséquence du désir d'être à la hauteur de sa fonction de vaisseau pur. À cause de cette idée, Hollow Knight n'était plus vide. Cela a permis à la radiance de prendre le dessus à partir de ce rêve. Intéressant. Et fun fact, il y a un mode avec une variante d'Oumu à l'envers et plus dur à battre et il s'appelle Ouwu. Ok.
itself? Can it form strategies? Does it host a podcast?
Alors, je pense pas.
Well,
Par contre, il mange de l'eau bouillante, moi je pense.
Rip-off, the Void is powerful, but not unified. So while it can thrash around at things that come near it, or call out in unison to turn off a light, it's not a single conscious being. Getting back to the Pale King, one could argue that the Void might have played a role in his ultimate demise,
Ouais.
and I've argued that viewpoint in the past. But we have to remember that there isn't enough evidence to know for sure. As an expert lawyer and a good friend of mine, Johnny Cochran, once said, "Any evidence that the Void was involved in the Pale King's death is circumstantial. My name is Johnny Cochran." Just above the White Palace, the bugs in the City of Tears weren't faring much better. Even if we ignore the fact that the infection was still around, there were other issues that helped lead to the city's downfall. Due to the gates being sealed, some bugs resorted to cannibalism in order to avoid.
Alors ça, j'ai pas vu non plus. Ça, je vous le garantis, j'ai pas vu non plus. On dirait dans les cuisines ou je sais pas quoi. Il y a des insectes lampadaires, enfin on comprend rien. On comprend rien, c'est dégueulasse. En raison de la fermeture des ports, certains insectes ont eu recours au cannibalisme pour éviter la famine.
Starvation. And there's also that metric fuck ton of corpses lining the walls of the Soul Sanctum.
Wingo!
When all was said and done, the only citizen left standing is Eternal Emelita.
Emelita, ça me dit quelque chose. Merci Angirl, merci beaucoup pour le prime et les 2 mois, merci. Je crois que c'est juste une room, mais y a moyen, hein.
Who just laughs her ass off about it like she's a fucking Dark Souls character. The White Lady ends up in a cocoon deep within the Queen's gardens. She decided to place bindings on herself in order to keep her from spreading her seed.
Ah oui,
She
d'accord.
claims that this is because of the shame she feels in helping the Pale King create the vessels, but honestly, it's probably just her kink. The White Lady also diminished her power, possibly as a way to keep herself hidden from unwanted visitors.
Merci Papa Sangre,
Outside
merci
her
beaucoup pour le
cocoon,
prime.
Dryas stood guard, protecting her queen from the violent
Ouais.
trade of mantises. Dryas is eventually killed off by these bugs, which is actually pretty pathetic if you think about it.
Oui.
I mean, we're talking like the Netgear WPN824N N150 wireless router pathetic. Speaking of great knights dying pathetically, let's move on to Hagemul. Hagemul held the city crest, a key used to open one of the gates to the City of Tears.
Ouais.
At some point, Hagemul's armor shell was stolen by a maggot. Now, maggots were generally looked down upon and forced to do menial labor. They were incredibly weak, and basically deserved all of the discrimination they got. But this
Putain.
one maggot decided to turn the tide, so he stole Hagemul's
Ah, bah oui,
shell
c'est
so that he
vrai.
could defend his downtrodden brothers.
Oh, quel
His
boss
actions
horrible.
weren't motivated by the infection, but instead was the result of how hierarchical caste systems will always lead to revolution from the working class, and that true freedom can only be achieved blah blah blah, capitalism is bad, subscribe to my Patreon. Ogrim moved to the Royal Waterways and started living in
Nice
shit,
transition.
changing his name to Dung Defender. Now I love wallowing in shit as much as the next guy, But you'd have to really love shit to put up with living with the flukes. The Dung Defender kept an unwavering sense of duty and loyalty to the king, and love for his fellow knights. So much so that he made shit statues of them. How nice. Ogrim acted as the defender of the pipeways, as well as Isma's Grove. A section of the royal waterways became filled with acid, and in the middle of it all rests Isma's corpse,
Ouais.
which has been overcome by plant
Ça, je m'en
life.
souviens pas bien.
Isma is likely the one responsible for this acid blight.
Je
but we
pense
have
y
no
être
idea
allé,
what
mais
happened to her. Hornet's whereabouts during this time
parle pas de
are
ouf.
fairly mysterious. We know that she departed Deep Nest and didn't return until the events of the game. At
Ouais.
some point, she took to guarding Halnest from intruding warriors, as well as the cast-off shell in the Kingdom's Edge. Despite the Kingdom's woes at large, fortunately this fate did not befall one of the fandom's favorite characters. The Menderbugs continued to fix the broken signs and wayposts of Halnest. From a diary entry, we can see that one Menderbug in particular had found himself on the precipice of a long and loving relationship.
Hello again, diary. Not long now until the next Minder Bash. For us stealthy types, we're a riotous bunch when we get together, and Minderberry kept flashing me that smile. It might be time to muster my courage and act on it. I love my home and my life, but sharing it with another? Why, that'd be the berry on top.
Greenpath also underwent some
je l'ai
changes
jamais vu
during
non
this
plus.
time. The Mosskin were waiting for Un's call, which would bring them back into the dream they were originally born from. But for some reason, Un's strength deteriorated. We don't know why this happened exactly. Was it due to the White Lady claiming part of her kingdom? Was it somehow due to the infection? Some Mosskin believe
Ou
that
de la
Un
même
went into
infection
hiding,
d'ailleurs.
but it appears as though Un is, in fact, calling to her children. But many of the Mosskin are unable to hear her call. Instead, many Mosskin seem to have taken the Radiance's infection into their leaves, which might explain why Greenpath became overgrown with vegetation despite Un's deteriorating powers. Mossy vagabonds even openly chose to forsake Un and worship the Radiance.
Mais ça me fume qu'il y ait vraiment des éléments du jeu qui clairement, comme vous me le dites, et vous me le dites de manière très sérieuse quand même, ne sont pas trouvables sans internet. C'est-à-dire que vraiment, on en est quand même à un certain niveau de trucs cachés, quoi, tu vois, c'est chaud en vrai. Et en fait, je me dis, du coup, moi, la question que je me pose, c'est en mode, ok, c'est caché, mais c'est caché comment en fait? Je suis en mode, est-ce que c'est un mur à péter? Est-ce que il faut aller dans l'eau Pardon, est-ce qu'il faut aller dans l'eau acide à un endroit peut-être pour passer sous un caillou ou sous un rebord? Est-ce que c'est un sol à casser? Est-ce que j'en sais rien, est-ce que c'est un truc qui est dans les hauteurs qu'on n'arrive pas à voir? Enfin, tu vois, je suis en mode un panneau à péter. C'est-à-dire que genre tu pètes un panneau et ça débloque un truc, genre 3% en cassant un panneau, entrer-sortir de la salle. What? Ah ouais, d'accord. Non mais attends. Donc là, t'es en train de me dire que quand tu casses ce panneau-là, tu as 3% de chance que le mob arrive ou que ça t'ouvre quelque chose. Mais c'est un truc de fou. Casser le panneau de décor qui est en bas du puits et revenir dans la pièce. Il y a un pourcentage de chance pour que l'insecte soit là en train de le réparer. Faut le buter et ça ouvre sa maison. Et vous dites que c'est en bas du puits? En bas du puits de Dirtmouth, le puits principal, genre? Ah! Ouais, donc en gros, ça veut dire que tu pètes le panneau, tu ressors, tu reviens. Tu pètes le panneau, tu ressors, tu reviens. Tu pètes le panneau, tu ressors, tu reviens jusqu'à ce qu'il soit là, quoi. Mais si tu le tues, le panneau ne sera plus jamais réparé. Ok. Et le pire, c'est que du coup, péter le panneau, ça te débloque une maison dans laquelle il y a du or. Parce que moi, j'ai la maison de la petite, là. Je sais plus comment elle s'appelle. La petite insecte qui nous kiffe de fou et qui ensuite kiffe Zot, là. Mais j'ai pas la maison de lui, quoi. D'accord, ok. Ok. Bon, intéressant.
Another tribe to be screwed over by the Radiance is the Hive, which fell to the infection after the death of
la
their
ruche.
leader, Hive Queen Vespa.
Miss...
But it appears as though this had little effect on their civilization. The Radiance's hive mind was already familiar to the bees, since the Hive probably operated under something similar already. So in other words, the Hive
J'en peux plus
probably
de mon
made
voisin
out
qui
the
fume.
best in
Ça
this whole
casse les couilles.
situation. Let's
Bisous,
turn our
Delta.
attention back to the moths. After
Ce sera sur
all,
YouTube, hein,
it's
t'inquiète.
their god that keeps killing everybody. Well, the moth tribe didn't fare too well, actually, as pretty much the entire tribe died out. The only known survivor is the seer.
La voyante.
Despite the loss of her tribe, the seer continued to tend to the graves and the resting grounds, while also waiting the arrival of the wielder, a mysterious
Ouais.
being that her tribe has dreamt of for a while. In the kingdom's edge, the land became covered in ash molting off of the worm's decomposing corpse. The Colosseum of Fools continued to thrive. The Lord Fool passed away at some point, but nobody really seems to notice or even care. The fools inside the Colosseum were infected, but still seem to have maintained control over themselves. It seems
Ah.
possible that
Mais ils
these
sont
bugs
infectés?
took in the infection willingly, similar to the Traitor Lord and his followers. This would have given them an edge in combat, similar to using steroids, but without the whole shrinking testicles thing. However, even the Traitor Lord and his followers went mad, so what makes these fools any more special? As for the Pale King's champion, the Pale Lurker,
Ouais.
well, she just went the normal kind of insane. There appears to have been another unforeseen event with the Pale King's plan. When the Hollow Knight was originally chosen, the door to the Abyss was sealed, trapping
Ouais.
the discarded vessels within.
Oui,
But
ok.
apparently, some vessels didn't get the memo. Vessel corpses can be found littered throughout the kingdom. There's one in the ancient basin, one in
Ouais.
Green Path,
Ouais,
and
c'est vrai,
several
hein.
trapped in Nosk's lair and Deep Nest.
Ouais, c'est vrai, c'est
Another
vrai, c'est
vessel
vrai.
that
Hein.
escaped from the Abyss is the player character, the Knight.
The Night.
The exact details on how the vessels escaped the Abyss is unclear. There are indications that they might have slipped into Deep Nest through some old passageway.
Mais c'est vrai qu'actuellement, on n'a pas l'explication de. Eh ben nous, quoi. Je suis en mode de. Eh ben nous, du coup. En fait, on sort d'où et comment on est là, quoi. Non, mais vraiment, bah, c'est toutes les heures, ça fume soit une clope, soit du shit, soit de la bœuf. Et comme moi, je suis juste au-dessus et qu'en dessous, en gros, ils ont une terrasse. Donc, du coup, eux, ils sont sur le niveau de la terrasse, ils sont en train de fumer, donc ça monte directement dans ma fenêtre. Et ça. Et moi, je sais pas, ça me prend trop. Surtout quand je suis. En fait, quand je suis en soirée ou quoi, je m'en fous, mais quand je suis en train de live et de parler comme ça, là, ça me saoule. Et j'en peux plus, là. Et il y a Pouzo qui a dit TKT. Je pense que ça va venir. Ouais.
Given void influences in part
J'ai un
of the
ventilateur
area
qui tourne,
and
mais
all
ça
the
fait rien.
corpses found in Nosk's lair. At some point, all
Ah,
entrances to Hollow
ils ont
Nest
leur
were
droit, hein.
closed off,
Enfin.
with the old well and Dirtmouth being the only way to sneak back in.
Il y a aucun
Despite
truc qui
this,
leur
several
empêche de
people
fumer,
have
quoi.
wormed their way into the kingdom, with few ever returning. Characters like Relic Seeker Lem seemed content to just pillage artifacts from the ruined kingdom, but other bugs seemed interested in something greater. In the Howling Cliffs rests the corpse of a member of the Grim Troop.
Oh
The
oui.
task of this
Ok.
bug appears to have been to seek out Hallownest, so that the troop might be summoned to the kingdom in the future.
Ah ouais,
the
d'accord.
Grim Troop are basically
Incroyable.
a group of bugs that serve a higher being known as the Nightmare.
Bon alors ça, moi, du coup,
The
je
troop
connais
keeps
rien,
the
donc
heart
là,
alive by
je me
feeding
fais
on the nightmares of
spoil
fallen
pour
kingdoms. This
selon une
process also
grande
involves
majorité d'entre vous, mais moi je suis en mode je
sacrificing
découvre,
the
quoi.
troop master to his own child because, hey, look at this cool ass boss battle. Another important group that traveled to Hallownest
Je le ferai.
are the God Seekers. After being abandoned by their old gods, the gods of thunder and the gods of rain,
Ok.
these bugs left their home in the land of storms, seeking out a new god to worship. The God Seekers looked to gods to save them from their own
J'allais dire
silent
c'était où
mind.
ça hein?
While traveling through the wastelands, the God Seekers constructed devices called God Tuners, which
Okay.
helped them seek out new gods. Through this
Putain.
device, they were able to detect the lingering power of the Pale King and
C'est quoi
find
cette
their way
scène?
to Hallownest.
Encore
When they
DLC,
arrived,
ok.
however, the God Seeker was forced into hibernation. She was encased in a strange
c'est
sarcophagus-like
stylé.
cocoon, which was itself chained up with a lock. It's not clear how this forced hibernation worked, seeing as the cocoon appears to have been made by the God Seeker herself. As for who put the cocoon in chains, I think the most likely candidate is the Dung Defender,
Défenseur
considering how the
bousier.
God Seeker's cocoon is found in the Junk Pit in the waterways, an area the Dung Defender has tasked himself with protecting.
La fosse à ordures des
This
voies
was the
d'eau.
general picture of Hallownest after the Hollow Knight was sealed inside the Temple of the Black Egg. The kingdom was stuck in a kind of stasis, with the Pale King civilization destroyed, and the Radiance unable to break free from her chains. The
I
Pale
want
King was
to
rebelling
break
against
free.
nature, trying to keep his work standing indefinitely. The stasis over Hallownest held for an age. How long is that exactly? Well, we have no idea.
Ok.
As I'm sure you've noticed, there really isn't a timeline for anything that happens in this game.
Il y en a pas. Il y a
We also
zéro.
have no idea
Zéro
how long any
timeline.
of these bugs can actually live. Elderbug wasn't around to see the stagways open, but we know several other characters were. Implying
Ouais.
that Elderbug is probably one of the youngest characters in the whole game. But this stasis over Hallownest wasn't going to last forever. At some point, the Radiance erupted out of the Hollow Knight, cracking its shell, and releasing a loud and powerful roar. The amount of infection leaking out of the Hollow Knight became even greater. The many corpses that lined the roads and cities of the kingdom sprang to life, with the amplified power of the infection.
Ouais.
This strengthened infection prompted the departure of the Weavers back to their old home.
Ok.
Now this old home might actually be Farloom, the kingdom in which Hollow Knight Silksong
Cet ancien territoire pourrait en fait être Farloom, le royaume dans lequel le Hollow Knight Silksong
takes place.
a
But
lieu.
the amount of knowledge we have about Silksong right now is pathetic, so I'm not saying that's confirmed or anything. This is also around the time that Quirrell arrives back in Hallownest.
Ah mais ouais, en fait, en particulier ce qu'il vient de dire, ça suggère vraiment que même Silksong, ok, ça a été annoncé, ok, on voit à peu près de quoi ça traite, etc. Mais en même temps, d'un point de vue histoire et storyline, il y a zéro, quoi. C'est en mode, bon bah... Enfin, il y a vraiment un espèce de monde et univers et environnement entier à découvrir, même si on va jouer à peu près de la même manière que Hollow Knight, même si j'ai l'impression qu'il y a quand même quelques éléments assez différents. C'est... Ah ouais, les secrets, quoi. Ah oui, Quirrell, notre super pote. Le lore de Silksong, il y a Hornet. On sait que c'est un préquel. Oui, donc du coup, préquel est égal l'histoire de Silksong et ce qu'on va découvrir se déroule avant Hollow Knight. That's right? That's right?
His memory of Motomon appears to have been clouded due to his time outside of Hallownest. These events are depicted in the Quirrell prequel comic.
Oui, c'est pas 100% sûr, mais il y a de grandes chances. Mais même là, il vient de le dire. Ces événements sont dépeints dans la bande dessinée préquel... Ah non, rien à voir. Rien à voir. Let's go. Quirrell qui montre également une image... Ça, par contre, j'ai pas vu. Dans la bande dessinée préquel Quirrell qui montre également une image du
which also shows an image of the Hollow Knight with a pre-cracked
Hollow Knight
shell.
avec une carapace
This
fêlée.
could mean
Ok.
that Quirrell's arrival happens roughly the same time the Hollow Knight shell cracks. At around the same time Quirrell arrives in
Ok, donc c'est
Hallownest,
pas
we
100%
also
sûr
see the
vis-à-vis de
arrival of
Silksong.
a
Ok.
player character, who is
Ça, c'est
commonly
fou.
referred to as the Knight. The Knight was one of the lucky vessels that was able to make its way out of the
Ok.
abyss. Somehow,
Donc on est
the
bel et
Knight
bien
ended
sorti
up
des abysses.
venturing beyond Hallownest and into the wilds beyond. It's implied that the Knight was called to Hallownest by either the sealed Hollow Knight or the Radiance within. Regardless, once the Knight shows up and yeets itself off this glyph, the actual game of Hollow Knight finally begins.
Ouais.
Now, there's a lot of details we could get into. Hallownest
Pire
is
monstre.
full of NPCs and bosses, each with their own
J'ai pas vu cette merde.
stories to
Je pense. Je pense. C'est du coup... Bon, du coup, on sait où est-ce que c'est. À peu près. Du moins. Donc, faudra tester tous les murs de cette zone. Mais je pense pas avoir vu ça, hein. Je crois pas. Hein.
tell. But to be honest, I don't think we need to go through all of them, since their stories are relatively straightforward.
Ouais.
For example, let's look at the Brooding Moloch.
Ah oui.
So why is the Brooding Moloch brooding? Because all its friends are dead.
Ouais. Good point. En vrai, good point. Hein. C'est... Oui.
And there you go. That's the lore for the Brooding Moloch. Also, it's the only character in the game with a visible asshole.
Ah.
Now, did you really
Ok.
need me to explain that to you? Probably not.
Ok.
So instead, I'm just going to talk about the interactions relating to Hollow Knight's main story. The Knight is eventually noticed by Hornet, who lures it deep into
Ouais.
Green Path. There, Hornet attempts to kill the Knight, claiming
Ouais.
that she knows what it would try to do.
Hornet nul à
At
chier, hein,
this
d'ailleurs,
point,
il faut le
Hornet
dire, je
views
pense.
the Knight
C'est assez
as being
important.
too weak.
Hornet, ça a
After
été
the
one
fight,
try les
Hornet
deux
can
fois
be
que je l'ai
found
croisé,
in
je
the
crois.
City
hein.
of Tears, next to the statue of the Hollow Knight. Hornet mentions that the Knight has gained a resilience due to the time it spent in the void beyond Hallownest.
Ouais.
This could be referring to the fact that some of those who leave Hallownest lose their memories, meaning the Knight would have no memories of its own tragic conception. Hornet tells the Knight that if it seeks to continue the stasis that keeps Hallownest standing, it must seek the Graven Ash. which is referring to the Kingdom's
Ok,
Edge.
ouais,
At
logique.
this moment, Hornet sees the Knight as a possible replacement for the Hollow Knight.
Ouais.
Basically, the Knight could break the seals that keep the Hollow Knight locked away, defeat the Hollow Knight, and contain the infection itself. It's at this point that I should mention that Hollow Knight actually has 5 different endings, because of course
Ok. J'en avais fait 2. Comme une légère envie de relancer le jeu, quoi.
it would. I'm going to be explaining each of these endings in this
Okay.
video, as they each give us a different glimpse into the mechanics of Hollow Knight's world.
Alors, je l'ai dit, je m'en fiche que ça fasse partie... Oui, forcément, c'est du spoil, parce que je l'ai pas encore découvert, moi, seul, de mon côté, mais je m'en fiche, parce que je vais les revivre moi-même dans le jeu. Donc, au contraire, je suis plutôt content de pouvoir découvrir, quoi.
Now, to get the easiest ending to Hollow Knight, Hornet's instructions to go to the Kingdom's Edge can be ignored completely. If the Knight stumbles upon the resting grounds, the 3 dreamers will appear and cast the Knight into the dream realm.
Ouais, bien
There,
sûr.
Seer will come to the Knight's rescue and grant it the Dream Nail,
Bien sûr.
a special blade that can tear the veil between the real world and the dream world.
Ok,
With the
good.
Dream Nail, the Knight can venture to the resting places of the 3 dreamers, curb stomp their asses, and unlock the entrance to the Black Egg.
Et là,
Inside the egg, the Knight finds the Hollow Knight
Voilà.
chained up, silently watching over it. Once the chains are broken, the Hollow Knight screams with that familiar Radiance roar and pursues the Knight. As the fight progresses, the Hollow Knight starts trying to kill itself, Quirrell style. But then the Radiance starts using the Hollow Knight's body to perform her own attacks.
ouais, donc en fait, quand il se fait contrôler comme ça, c'est vraiment Radiance qui prend le contrôle sur Hollow Knight. Et c'est ce que vous avez dit un peu tout à l'heure aussi avec les différentes théories de par le simple souvenir, le simple rêve une fois qu'il a pu avoir, ça a amené à ce que Radiance prenne le contrôle, quoi.
But then the Radiance starts using the Hollow
Ouais.
Knight's body to perform her own attacks. Once defeated, the Hollow Knight begins to spew infection all over the place. The Knight can then focus the infection into itself.
Ouais.
This results in the first ending of the game, called Hollow Knight. In this ending, the Knight usurps the Hollow Knight, prolonging the stasis over Hallownest. New chains and bindings appear out of fuck if I know, and contain the Knight, and a new seal is placed over the entrance to the Black Egg. Now there is one giant question looming over this ending. Can the Knight actually contain the infection indefinitely, or will the Radiant still manage to break free one day? Before we answer this question, let's look at some of the other events that can transpire while playing the game. If the player chooses to go to Kingdom's Edge, Hornet will challenge the Knight one last time as
Ouais.
a final test of strength. After her defeat, Hornet allows the Knight to access the cast-off
Ça, on
shell,
se souvient
where
bien.
the Pale King was originally hatched.
Et là, on va
By interacting
récupérer...
with this egg,
Voilà.
the Knight's shell is marked with the King's brand, technically making the Knight the new ruler of Hallownest.
Ouais, globalement, quoi.
With the King's brand, the Knight can now open the entrance to the Abyss
Ouais.
and discover the place of its birth. When leaving the Abyss, the Knight can encounter Hornet again, where for the first time, Hornet
Hornet est
suggests that
sympa.
there are actually 2 outcomes the Knight can enact. She
Ouais.
tells the Knight that it can either prolong Hallownest stasis or face the heart of the Kingdom's infection. Within the Knight, Hornet sees a chance for change. Instead of just replacing the Hollow Knight, Hornet believes that it may be possible to get rid of the infection completely by using the void inside of the Knight.
Mhm.
After visiting the Abyss and obtaining the Shade Cloak, the Knight is capable of reaching the White Lady,
Ouais.
hidden away in the Queen's
Donc c'est pour ça que ça, c'est vraiment une
The
étape
White
late
Lady
game,
tells
quoi.
the Knight that she has been awaiting a vessel to accept a gift. That gift being one half of a charm called the King's Soul, which
Non mais n'empêche, quand il réfléchit, c'est horrible, parce que déjà, tu ne comprends rien au lore. T'arrives après une vingtaine d'heures de jeu vers un personnage quand même qui a l'air particulièrement important, et il te parle de vaisseau. T'es en mode, mais c'est quoi en fait? Ça n'a aucun sens, tu vois. C'est-à-dire que vraiment pour arriver à faire le rapprochement que les vaisseaux, c'est finalement les personnages qui ressemblent à ton propre personnage, qui ont pu avoir une importance pour pouvoir développer quelque chose. Enfin, genre c'est trop dur en fait. C'est vraiment trop dur, genre.
she claims will give the Knight more power. The White Lady goes on to explain that she can feel the weakening of the Hollow Knight within her roots. She tells the Knight that it is free of the blemishes that made the Hollow Knight a flawed vessel. From this dialogue, it is implied that the knight truly is a pure vessel,
Ouais.
capable of containing the radiance successfully. But it's not quite that simple, so we're gonna have to dig a bit deeper into this. Basically, we're gonna need to answer a simple question. What exactly does it mean to be a Hollow Knight? Despite the White Lady's words, we have a number of instances where the characters and item descriptions mention that the knight has a will, and maybe even a mind. But from the Pale King's dialogue when describing the Hollow Knight, it is stated that a
No
pure
will to
vessel
break.
has no mind or will.
Ça,
So
je m'en
is the White
souviens.
Lady wrong? Or maybe even lying? Her eyes have been clouded by time, and she can be tricked into thinking that Ogrim is in the room when the knight is wearing the Defender's Crest charm.
Oui, d'une certaine manière aussi, est-ce que la traduction nous aide pas, nous, d'une certaine manière? C'est chaud.
She also thinks that Drya is still alive, which,
Non.
So maybe the White Lady is just senile. My problem with that theory is that the White Lady states that the vessels stand out to her clearly in a misted world, due to them being her spawn. She also questions whether or not the knight sought her aid, which would imply that the knight must have some kind of will. So for whatever reason, the White Lady thinks the knight is still capable of containing the radiance, even if it's still able to make decisions. After all, the Hollow Knight was considered pure, but they still taught it how to wield a fucking sword. I mean, if the knight were truly and completely hollow in a literal sense, it probably shouldn't even be able to walk, or draw a map, or open a goddamn bank account. In short, this whole concept of being hollow is so abstract and hard to define, I don't really feel comfortable giving a solid answer on whether or not the knight is or isn't truly hollow, and I think the game leaves room open for other interpretations. Of course, the White Lady's gift is useless without the other half of the King's Soul. In order to reach it, however, the knight must travel to the White Palace, locked inside the body of a King's Mold. In order to bypass the seal, the knight must use a fully awakened Dream Nail. It can do this by bringing 1800 essence to the seer, allowing her to sharpen the weapon's blade. If the knight does this, the seer remarks that the knight truly is the wielder that her tribe has been dreaming of.
Ouais.
There's no explicit reason why the Moth tribe was dreaming about this supposed wielder so much, but it seems like they believe the wielder would wash away the crimes the Moth tribe committed by turning their backs on the Radiance. The seer seems to know that the knight might kill the Radiance, and she seems accepting of it, ready for her and her tribe to disappear and be forgotten forever. With the awoken Dream Nail in hand, the knight can travel to the
Assez
Pale
triste comme
King's
histoire pour les
refuge
papillons quand
and
même.
locate the other half of the King's Soul charm.
The Morph.
When equipped, the King's Soul provides a never-ending supply of soul,
Ouais.
making it almost useful if it weren't for the insanely high cost of the charm, and the painfully slow rate at which it increases, and the fact that the charm will get replaced in about 5 minutes after you get it.
Ouais.
The King's Soul charm itself symbolizes the union
Réel.
between two higher beings. To me, this implies that the King's Soul is a representation of a vessel, which also was created by the union of two higher beings. With the King's Soul in their inventory, the knight now gains access to an area in the abyss called the Birthplace.
Ah ouais.
In this massive pile of vessel shells, the knight can find a giant egg. Dream nailing
J'ai mis
the egg
tellement de temps à la
allows the knight
trouver,
to
ça.
access its own memory
À la
when it was
comprendre.
cast down into the abyss. From viewing that memory, the King's Soul charm is replaced with the Void Heart charm. The recollection of this event allows the knight to come to terms with the void inside itself. Once the knight has the Void Heart, the shades in the abyss no longer attack it, and
Oui,
that
c'est vrai.
strange creature that gives the knight the Shade Cloak.
Mais si vous vous souvenez de mon let's play, par contre moi je me suis vraiment pas arrêté de les attaquer. C'est-à-dire que certes moi ils m'attaquaient plus, mais par contre moi je les ai vraiment fumés. Et ça y avait aucun problème.
Calls it the Lord of Shades. In other words, the knight has now bound the once fragmented void under its own will, allowing it to control the void in a powerful new way. With the union of the void, the Pale King, and the White Lady, the knight has gained a strength before unseen. It is with this charm that 2 additional endings become unlocked.
Ok.
Hornet will now
Donc
be
moi j'en ai fait
standing
une.
outside of the Black Egg, offering to help the knight should the opportunity arise.
Ouais.
Midway through the fight with the Hollow Knight, Hornet rushes into battle, subduing the Hollow Knight and piercing its shell. It's at this point that the knight is given the perfect opportunity to enter into the mind of its sibling, fighting the source of the infection head on, and finally putting an end to the Radiance's tyranny.
Ok.
Or it can just stand there and let Hornet get knocked unconscious. If the knight finishes off the Hollow Knight as usual, the sealed sibling ending occurs. Basically, it's the same as the Hollow Knight ending, but now Hornet is in the room
What
too,
the
and her face
fuck?
appears on the door of the Black Egg.
What
It's not clear what
the
exactly this means for Hallownest. This might imply that Hornet is now a dreamer, but she's inside the temple.
Mais non, mais je me demande du coup s'il y a des gens... À quel point, quel est le pourcentage de gens qui ont eu cette fin-là? Parce que en fait, ils se sont retrouvés dans cette situation-là, en mode... Bah, je sais pas quoi faire. Et genre ils sont restés comme ça. En mode, ah, je sais pas quoi faire, c'est horrible. Et puis là, du coup, Hornet s'est fait stun. Et ils étaient en mode, bah, ok. Et du coup, ils l'ont tué. Et ils ont eu cette fin. Sérieux. Moi, j'ai continué à le taper et j'ai eu cette... Oui, si tu le tapes, c'est pareil. Oui, ok, ouais. Ok. Bah, du coup, trop marrant. Parce que moi, j'étais là, j'ai vu les trucs de rêve partir de sa tête, instantanément, j'étais en mode aiguillon. Mais du coup, ça veut dire que... Je sais pas s'il y a des gens ici qui étaient là, justement, lundi, quand je l'ai fait. Mais oui, j'imagine trop les gens, justement, qui ont regardé le let's play, qui étaient au courant de ces deux possibilités-là, et qui m'ont vu faire, tu vois. Et ça devait être marrant, je pense.
Now a dreamer, but she's inside the temple, meaning that no one can actually get in there to kill her should the knight ever start leaking infection. At the same time, Hornet mentions that the bindings of the black egg would drain her, so she's probably just going to die anyway, right? Generally, people consider this to be one of the worst endings, but it's worth pointing out that Team Cherry doesn't support any one ending as being the true ending.
Ok.
Each ending is canonical in its own right, and honestly, this ending isn't the worst. At least the Knight and Hornet will get to spend some quality time together. If the Knight does dream of the Hollow Knight, it will be taken to an arena where it can finally fight the Radiants head-on.
Donc moi, ça c'est ce que j'ai fait.
Alone, as the other shades from the Abyss will appear in order to help corner the Radiants. Eventually, the Radiance gets trapped in the tendrils of the Void. The Knight bitch slaps her a couple times, and then the Radiance is consumed into the darkness. The black egg then appears to turn to shadows and the void seeps down into the ground. Hornet awakens to find the Knight's broken shell lying on the floor. We get one final shot of the shades in the abyss going to rest, and the game is over. This ending is called the Dream No More ending. The Radiance is gone, and Hallownest is finally free from her infection.
Et c'est vrai que du coup, moi je trouve que quand on voit cette fin, du coup c'est difficile de juger et de se dire que Silksong ce sera forcément et nécessairement un préquel, dans le sens où le jeu pourrait très bien se dérouler un peu après cette fin là, tu vois, enfin je sais pas, je dis ça comme ça parce que là ça me vient en tête, tu vois, et j'en sais rien, c'est un peu c'est un peu je veux dire il y a aucun fondement, tu vois, d'une certaine manière, mais Hornet est vivante là à la fin de cette fin là, donc au final est-ce que le prochain jeu pourrait très bien pas être une potentielle suite de cette fin-ci? Bah j'en sais rien, tu vois, j'en sais rien, moi je dis juste ça comme ça.
Now I think it's fair to ask.
C'est confirmé, c'est un préquel. D'ailleurs, les devs disent que toutes les fins de et qu'il n'y a pas de truc. Oui, mais ça, c'est ce qu'il vient de dire avant. Mais justement, quand on parlait du préquel, soi-disant, personne l'a vraiment confirmé. Bonjour, Panda Zozia. Bonjour. Les devs ont annoncé que la suite d'Hollow Knight, si suite il y a, prendra compte de toutes les fins possibles d'Hollow Knight. Bah, ouais. Donc en fait, si les devs ont annoncé ça, ça veut dire que ça ne peut pas être une suite, puisqu'il y a quand même une suite où Hornet meurt, donc c'est un peu bizarre, tu vois. Ma théorie, mais après avoir fini Silksong, on saura toujours pas si c'est un préquel ou un sequel. Vrai. Let's go. Maintenant, je pense qu'il est juste... je pense que qu'il est juste bon de poser quelques questions sur la façon dont la fin des rêves se produit.
A few questions about how the Dream No More ending comes about. When the Hollow Knight was initially chosen to become the pure vessel, the Abyss was sealed up and the rest of the vessels were left to rot away. But somehow, vessels ended up outside of the Abyss, and then one of those vessels was used to replace the Hollow Knight. Exactly how much of this operation was planned, if at all? The White Lady was waiting for a vessel. Did she have any communication with Hornet? Hornet was guarding the King's Brand, the only way for a vessel to enter the Abyss. How did she know it was necessary to guard the King's Brand from weaker vessels? Hell, if the vessels did escape the Abyss by themselves, wouldn't it be pointless to guard the King's brand, since the vessels could just creep back into the abyss the same way? I'm not going to provide any good answers to these questions.
Il devrait pas sortir un Hollow Knight, mais sur le même style de Hades, en mode le vaisseau qui essaye d'aller au bout des choses, tu vois. Moi, ça me fait penser à ça. Ça donne trop l'impression qu'il y a plein de vaisseaux qui ont essayé de tenter une run, mais juste ils sont morts, quoi. Donc ils ont arrêté. C'est que ça sera dans une timeline différente, sûrement. Le fait de voir les vaisseaux dead comme ça, Hollow Rogue Knight, c'est ça. Non mais bon, ça arrivera jamais. Mais c'est simplement le fait d'avoir cette perception de tous les vaisseaux qui doivent climb quelque chose et ensuite faire ce qu'ils ont à faire, parce qu'au final on sait même pas ce qu'eux ils ont vraiment à faire, parce que nous on est vraiment venus comme étant the Knight et tout, mais voilà. Et si on meurt au début de la run, on débloque l'achievement vaisseau sanguin.
Because God forbid I answer anything in this entire video. But I do want to point out that no plans to actually produce the Dream No More ending are explicitly stated in-game. So we can only speculate as to whether or not the White Lady or Hornet, or maybe even the Pale King, knew that they could defeat the Radiants by creating a Lord of Shades like the Knight.
Ouais.
Regardless, the next two endings were definitely not planned.
Ok.
In fact, the last two endings that were added in the Godmaster update almost feel out of place. The Godseekers basically hijack everything to the point where you don't even have to enter the Temple of the Black Egg to beat the game. That's like beating Mario Bros without ever seeing Bowser.
Mario Bros dans Crash Bandicoot, hein. C'est quand même à mentionner aussi, quoi. Mais tranquille.
But on the other hand, the Godmaster endings basically reinforce that Hollow Nest does not exist in a vacuum, which can help the world of Hollow Knight feel more real.
Oui, en plus, avec le boss de Sonic.
Because what else is reality but just a bunch of random chaotic stuff happening all the time? If the Knight finds the Godseeker in the junk pit, it will be able to enter her mind and refight all the bosses in the game.
What? Ah, il y a une plaque qui s'appelle le Hall of Gods qui permet de savoir, de voir tous les boss, quoi.
This is part of the Godseeker's ritual. They basically attune to the resonance of gods through ritual combat.
Ah, il y a le retour de Hornet.
This allows them to ascend their minds higher and eventually.
Waouh, ça a l'air d'être une partie du jeu de fou furieux.
Achieve communication with the gods sleeping in Hollow Nest's heart, the Radiance.
Okay.
Now I know what you're thinking. That's a pretty convoluted little religious practice they have going on here. What's next?
Tu peux combattre tout le monde, ok.
Measuring the Knight's Theon levels? It's pretty complicated, but the point is, these Godseekers have some serious capabilities to fuck things up in Hollow Nest, as we're about to see. As the Knight makes it further and further through the four Pantheons, the Godseekers get closer and closer to making
donc c'est ça le truc du Panthéon dont vous parliez souvent.
The Hollow Knight. At the end of the fourth Pantheon, the Radiance makes herself aware in this strange reunion cutscene between the vessels. But she isn't the only one to make an appearance. The Void itself appears to go on the attack, rising up to meet the Radiance's call. It's at this point that the final challenge, the Pantheon of Hollow Nest, becomes available. The Godseeker finally acknowledges the Knight as being more than just a simple cringer, and they begin to watch the Knight more intently. After defeating like a bazillion bosses in the final Pantheon, the Knight finally comes face to face with the Absolute Radiance, a stronger, more enhanced version of the game's final boss. Finally, the stage is set. After roughly 40 minutes of intense agony and tedious boss battles, the Knight has...
Attends, quoi? Comment ça, 40 minutes? 45 minutes de pur bonheur. Donc t'as 45 minutes de pur boss fight avec les boss les plus difficiles de Hollow Knight, quoi, en gros. Ok. Ah ouais, tu te fais 50 boss, littéralement. Tu te fais tous les boss. Let's go. Et si tu perds, tu refais tout. Putain, nice. Ok. Putain, j'ai trop hâte de one try ça. Let's go. Oui, et surtout à la fin, t'as Absolute Radiance, quoi. Donc à la limite, vaut mieux connaître un petit peu le fonctionnement de Absolute Radiance avant, quoi. Jamais tu one try, on verra. Hmm.
But first, let's check in on our old pal Menderbug. As it turns out, he's still alive when the knight arrives in Hallownest.
Mais non.
And he's still fulfilling his duty after all this time.
Si tu one try ça, tu mérites 500 subs. Ok, c'est noté.
Let's take one last look at his diary.
My lovely diary. Someone's gone and broke my favorite sign. Right there, at the top of the crossroads.
Tiens.
Keeps happening, too. But you know, I just can't get mad about it. I should be thanking them, really. More chances to fix that beautiful, complex sign. And I've stocked up on spare parts, so I've no fear it'll ever stay broken for long.
Unfortunately,
Thank you.
the only way to ever read the Menderbug's diary is to kill him in cold blood. I'm not sure why Team Cherry thought this was necessary, but the general consensus on Reddit is that they are bloodthirsty warmongers, so it checks out. But at least Menderbug's last moments will be spent fixing one of his favorite signs in the Forgotten Crossroads. It's comforting to think that his final seconds of consciousness were spent in total bliss, before we sent him hurtling into the infinite chasm that is Oblivion. Well, anyways, the alternate fight between the Knight and the Radiants plays out differently than in the vanilla ending. This time around, the Knight is not accompanied by any shades. Instead, after defeating the Radiants, the Knight seems to transform into this
Wow.
monstrosity.
Ah ouais, ok.
Now this creature goes by many names. The God of Gods, the Lord Shade, the Devourer,
Okay.
the Void Entity. But I don't really like any of those, so I will just call him Bill.
Ouais, Bill,
Bill
c'est bien.
proceeds to
vrai,
completely
c'est
annihilate
bien.
the Radiants in spectacular fashion. We are then treated to the Embrace the Void ending. Bill comes back down from the sky, dropping into the rest of Godhome. The Godseeker starts to get pulled into Bill by Void tendrils. We then cut to the Godseeker in the junk pit. Void starts leaking out of her eyes, and it appears as though Bill is making an escape back into the real world, which is
What the
probably a
fuck?
bad thing? Finally, we see Hornet standing outside of the Black Egg as the infection begins to disappear from nearby vines. Hornet
Okay.
hears footsteps coming from inside the Black Egg as the Hollow Knight reveals itself to her and the two prepare for combat. So from this
Okay.
cutscene, we can see that the Radiance's death in Godhome actually did kill her for real, meaning that the infection over Hallownest is now gone. This means the seals inside of the Black Egg probably wore off, allowing the Hollow Knight to escape its prison. In other words, the Embrace of the Void ending is a goddamn cliffhanger, and we have no idea how Team Cherry plans to follow this up. The Hollow Knight is running loose in Hallownest, and the Knight has transformed into a raging void monster that might try to destroy the entire kingdom, or at least what's left of it. What's even more strange about this ending is that the announced sequel, Hollow Knight Silksong, doesn't seem to be related to this ending at all, but that's a whole different shit show. Obviously, the biggest mystery surrounding this ending is the appearance of Bill. Did this creature exist in the void already, or was it somehow willed into existence by the power of the Godseekers? Did the Knight turn into this thing, or did it just become a part of it? Examining a statue of this creature and other forms of the Knight grant the player a Hunter's Journal entry for an ancient artifact called the Void Idol,
Void
which might
Idol.
imply this creature might have been worshipped by the ancient civilization. But again, that's pure speculation. We don't know what this worship of Void exactly looked like. Maybe the Void they worshipped took the form of something more sinister. There is one thing we know about this monster though. It's weak to flowers. Yes, these things. As it turns out, those delicate flowers that Zamir has stockpiled up her ass are actually useful for something. They contain a strange power that even deters the White Lady from touching one. The Godseeker, however, is dumb enough to accept a flower from the Knight.
Ok.
If the player does this, instead of Void being released out into the world, this flower pulls a no you, and the Godseeker and Void disappear into thin air. The flower itself is described as giving off a pale light, which appears to connect it to the pale beings. Like I
Ok,
said
ouais.
before, pale beings appear to be
FCF?
some form of top tier gods. As of right now, we are only aware of two, the Pale King and the White Lady.
Ouais, y en a pas
But
d'autres
the
quoi.
fact that Zamir brought these pale flowers from a faraway land implies that there are definitely more of them out there. Another small hint of the existence of pale beings are the pale ore items that can be found all over Hallownest. Did these come from the Pale King, or possibly some other pale being? And what exactly are they? Are they poop? In general, the Godmaster endings appear to be doing a lot of setup for future Hollow Knight content. Like I said before, Hollow Knight Silksong doesn't seem to connect these events on the surface, so we are in a bit of a bind when trying to discuss what these endings actually mean for the greater narrative Team Cherry is building. There's definitely a lot more to consider about what the Pale Beings are and what properties they possess, and we also have plenty of questions surrounding the
On arrive à la fin.
and how bugs have interacted with it in the past. It almost feels like we're looking through a keyhole, trying to grasp onto the totality of Team Cherry's creation. How powerful are creatures like Bill and the worms? Where did things like the Void even come from to begin with? How much bigger is the world beyond Hallownest? Is Bardoon into butt stuff? But of course, that's the appeal of a game like Hollow Knight. Having all of the answers to every question would just ruin the mystery of the world. Plus, if we didn't have questions like this to waste our time on, then what else would we be doing with our lives? Go outside? Ugh. And so this video comes to an end. Now I know the average attention span of a YouTube viewer is 9 minutes, so let me leave you with a few takeaways. 1. Hollow Knight is a game about bugs.
Ouais.
I know this may come as a shock, but it's true. Watch the video
Comme
again,
Grounded d'ailleurs.
and this time, pay attention. You'll notice right away, I promise. 2. Murdering your own babies might not be such a good idea after all. I mean, this is obviously just my interpretation of the game's lore. Other people might have
Bizarre.
different views on the subject of murdering
Non,
babies,
je pense que tout le monde est
and
d'accord.
every opinion is valid, so I don't want to step on anyone's toes or anything.
Ok, très bien, très bien.
3. Menderbug is fucking dead.
Non,
4.
pas chez moi.
Nothing is certain. This video probably has a few flaws in it. Trying to construct a cohesive narrative with the information found in Hollow Knight isn't exactly straightforward. I'm sure my views will change in the future, and I encourage you to explore the lore yourself. 5. And this last point is fairly obvious, but I should mention it anyway. Cory in the House is the best anime.
Ok, ok. Donc on est arrivé à la fin complète. Bon, du coup je comprends mieux aussi, clairement, il y a quand même une réalité de une fois que tu trouves le délire du Panthéon, il y a un nouveau jeu dans le jeu, parce qu'en réalité, là, si vous me dites que c'est 45 minutes de pure boss fight avec les boss fights les plus difficiles, tu te retrouves à avoir beaucoup de temps de jeu qui peut se rajouter en fonction de ton niveau, en fonction de comment tu t'en sors. Ok, c'est cool. En vrai, ça me rassure aussi parce que ça prouve à quel point, quand tu joues simplement au jeu une vingtaine d'heures comme je l'ai fait, c'est impossible de comprendre quoi que ce soit du lore, parce qu'il y a des mots qui sont utilisés avec dont nous on va avoir une certaine utilisation et qui vont avoir une utilisation complètement différente justement dans Hollow Knight. Je parle des vaisseaux en particulier, hein, voilà. Il y a tellement de mystères, tellement d'éléments cachés, tellement de trucs qu'on comprend pas. Parce que là, le truc, c'est que, ok, c'est expliqué en direct, mais ça ne dit pas nécessairement où est-ce qu'il faut les trouver, les voir, etc. Hein. Quand on a parlé des différents PNJ que moi je n'ai pas vu, il y a le Panthéon que j'ai pas vu, il y avait, l'ending, ça on s'en fiche un petit peu. Ne serait-ce que le petit bonhomme avec son panneau et la maison qui nous ouvre, tu vois. T'es en mode, mais comment tu peux prédire ça, prévoir ça? Ça n'a aucun sens, parce que même si quand t'arrives à cet endroit-là, tu pètes le panneau, tu te barres en fait, tu fais rien d'autre, tu vois. Donc c'est assez impressionnant. Et donc forcément, moi, ça me donne envie aussi d'y aller dans cette aventure-là. Non, la vidéo, elle est pas en VF. C'est du VOSTFR. Mais tout ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que moi j'ai bien envie de faire la suite, mais je vais pas pouvoir là maintenant, comme vous le savez, en tout cas pour la majorité. Je pars en vacances dès vendredi pour un petit temps. Au cas où, pour tous ceux qui ne l'ont pas, je vais bien évidemment vous partager cette vidéo si jamais vous voulez aller la voir de votre côté. Mais ces vaisseaux dans le sens porteur/transporteur, oui, bien évidemment, mais en fait le truc c'est que quand tu joues au jeu, c'est pas logique, tu vois, d'une certaine manière. C'est pas ce à quoi tu t'attends, parce qu'en fait même l'environnement est tellement flou que y a aucune logique à se dire que finalement nous sommes un vaisseau, tu vois, d'une certaine manière. Donc c'est assez ouf. Mais ouais, donc certes ça va faire une très grosse pause de Hollow Knight jusqu'à ce que je revienne. mais ce sera l'occasion justement de revenir là-dessus. Tu vois, j'hésitais un peu, j'étais en mode putain, j'aurais pu très bien faire ça jeudi à la place de Please Fix the Road, etc. Mais en fait, le truc c'est que ça va pas prendre une session, ça va prendre beaucoup plus de temps que ça. Donc en réalité, ça servirait même à rien que j'y retourne là dans juste demain, tu vois, ça n'a pas de sens. Donc ouais, non, c'est assez impressionnant. Je suis très content d'avoir regardé cette vidéo. Je sais pas à quel point c'était cool ou pas pour vous d'avoir pu suivre ça avec moi. Mais ouais, Hollow Knight, en fait, là où je suis très 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 content, c'est d'avoir fait ça avant que Silksong arrive, parce que du coup là je vais être parfait pour l'arrivée de Silksong. Je vais pouvoir le jour où Silksong arrivera, bah, je pourrai me mettre dessus bien comme il faut, tu vois. Donc ça, pour ça, c'est super bien. Et voilà, je pense que j'ai compris pas mal de choses. Au final, je trouve qu'au final, à la fin de la vidéo, je trouve pas ça si compliqué que ça, tu vois. C'est en vrai, une fois que c'est expliqué comme ça, c'est pas si compliqué. Mais c'est juste que de le comprendre au moment même où tu joues, ça c'est vraiment compliqué par contre, tu vois.